Chapter 752. The decisive battle has begun. Standing on the edge of a cliff and looking at the flame tornado in the distance, Keyes commented calmly. Beside him, Green, the commander-in-chief of the Ramsey Alliance Army, nodded. It's time for us to enter the battlefield. Just below this cliff, more than 50 infantry phalanxes had been arranged properly, and more than 1,000 heavily armored knights were sitting on their mounts. In addition, the support groups of the camels and polar bear men were all rubbing their hands, ready to fight at any time. Let's go march silently. When the herald on the cliff waved the signal flag in his hand, the commanders of the various military formations immediately issued orders. Every soldier was ordered to keep quiet, and a branch was tied in the mouth of the warhorse. You are now the commander-in-chief of this base. In the depths of the flame vortex, the demonic fish began to communicate with their psionic abilities. Rapullo calmly analyzed the situation. In addition to the Jodan troll, we also need more ordinary forces like the saltwater swamp giant. So, you have to pay something now. Before he finished speaking, Rapullo's tentacles attacked first and directly inserted into one of the amphibious demonic fish's gills. The other 7 guild counselors followed suit and all stretched out their tentacles. What are you doing? The amphibious demonic fish roared in horror. His body kept struggling, and at the same time, he also launched abilities such as Psionic Blast to get rid of the encounter of being bound. However, the other demonic fish counselors could also use the skills he knew. After paying the price of a few more scars on their bodies, they sealed all of the amphibious demonic fish's gills. To make you more valuable and provide some help to the demonic fish clan's colonization of this plane, Rapullo responded to the amphibious demonic fish's question with his psionic ability. At the same time, he secretly added in his heart, "Thank you for not killing me before." With all of its gills blocked, the amphibious demonic fish's spirit instantly became dispirited. It was almost unable to control its own body. The benthic demonic fish counselor used another tentacle to roll up the silver chain in his descendant's tentacle. I think Rapullo is right. When you became the commander of this base, you should have the consciousness to sacrifice yourself for our race. Then, the 6 bottom-dwelling demonic fish surrounded him. They did not care about the flames that were baptizing them. Instead, they focused all their attention on gnawing on the bodies of their former companions, which is a more important matter. Not long after, the amphibious demonic fish that was considered the representative of the demonic fish empire's youth faction was completely devoured. As for the other 6 councilmen, after replenishing their energy, their bodies grew a little bigger and their strength became a little stronger. Most importantly, they had also learned the other party's ability to move freely on land without any restrictions. It's time. Rapullo looked at the other demonic fish. I'll stop the enemy. You guys wake up those things. They were originally prepared for the amphibious demonic fish, and now it's activated with its power. It's considered local conditions. After saying this, Rapullo's body disappeared, and the next moment, he appeared in the sky above the flame vortex. Grodel's torrent of death. Rapullo opened his mouth, and tens of thousands of gallons of seawater gushed out from his mouth instantly, pouring into the flames below him. The so-called Grodale actually referred to a kind of bloated aquatic magic fish in the world of Origin of Spirits. There was a tumor-like pouch hidden in its spine. It was a small dimensional space with special functions that could store thousands of gallons of water. This kind of magic creature could absorb water in one place, including small fragments and even microscopic creatures, and then release it in another place to fight against some environments that were not conducive to its survival. Rapullo had once captured and kept some Grodale as pets. When he got tired of teasing them, this cruel demonic fish killed all the pets and took out their tumor-like pouches. In order to fight against the flame tornado transformed by the dog tamer, he directly opened the Grodal's organs hidden in his abdomen and released the seawater stored inside, forming a torrent of death that fell from the sky. Chi. Flames and water intersected, and steam rose up. Rapullo, who was in the sky, had to add a layer of mana shield to protect himself from the hot steam. However, his Torrent of Death did play a role and extinguish the attack of the Calamity General. He's the youngest now, and his brain is really fast. A few seven-bearded counselors saw the situation and reached a new consensus after a few words. Now is not the time to collect materials. Rapulo is right. Occupying Ramsey is of great significance to our race. Wake up those saltwater species. Seconded. The tentacles in front of the 5 demonic fish waved, as if they were tapping on some touch screen that ordinary people could not see. Following their movements, some of the armored monsters that were resisting the Dog Tamer's army seemed to have received some order and quickly retreated to the back. The carapace on their abdomens suddenly cracked and then broke into pieces. Round flesh rolled out of their abdomens, bounced twice on the ground, and then stretched out their limbs and heads. These pieces of flesh were the saltwater species of swamp giants, or rather, their infant form. After landing for a moment, they opened their cold, black eyes and stared at everything around them. Soon, these strange creatures that looked like toads tore apart the membranes that covered their green skin and charged at their first meal aggressively with a long, bony spear in their hands. They opened their fish-like mouths and tore apart the armored monsters that had fallen into a weakened state because of the birth just now. They swallowed all the flesh and carapace into their stomachs like a whirlwind, turning them into the nutrients needed for their own growth. As these saltwater species of swamp giants finished eating, they all became mature forms of 10 feet tall, with big shoulders and round waists. Guga, after finishing eating, the group of swamp giants immediately turned their attention to the monsters that were fighting. Driven by the never-ending hunger in their stomachs, they picked up their hooks and rushed to the new meal. Their webbed feet stomped on the ground powerfully. They were really like giant toads, jumping dozens of yards away in an instant. 2 claws gripped the hooks tightly and waved them around without a teacher. Stab, slash, flick, and swipe. The swamp giants repeated these 4 movements over and over again, killing indiscriminately with ease. Fortunately, the monsters were under the control of the demonic fish and tried their best to stay away from their unreasonable companions. Therefore, they killed the most monsters under the Dog Tamer's command. Chapter 753. The reason why they attacked indiscriminately was that these swamp giants were originally the spies of the demonic fish. Or, strictly speaking, they were the trump cards that the 6 seven-bearded counselors had set up around the amphibious demonic fish. There were still many similar trump cards, which were fatal traps that the demonic fish at the bottom had set up for each other. The demonic fish had long been accustomed to getting along with each other like this. Lapulo was like this, and so was the amphibious demonic fish that was being eaten. However, due to fate, this group of swamp giants, which were originally created for internal strife, had become the trump card to deal with Tribulation's army of monsters. It was very reasonable and also very demonic fish. With their addition, the monsters received great help in dealing with the monsters brought by Tribulation. At the very least, the swamp giants could easily use a fire-extinguishing technique to deal with the flame bomb of the blazing shadow beast or the scorching ray of the 10-armed octopus. Accompanied by the ear-piercing, croaking sound of frogs, these saltwater species spat out disgusting mud-like secretions from their big mouths. As long as the monsters cast spells at them, they would fight back vigorously. Although the half-flesh and half-machine chocobo riders produced by the Emperor's distortion kept firing arrows and bullets, it was futile when they hit the swamp giant's tumor-like hardened skin. After devouring the armored monsters, a layer of hard shell grew on the surface of their bodies. Monsters like the reef claw monsters were no match for the swamp giants that were huge but very agile. Even when these monsters felt tired or hungry, they would take the initiative to grab the lobster-like reef claw monsters, chew them, and swallow them. Only the evil crowmen and the flesh-like steam tanks would be a little troublesome for them. The former was generally equipped with weapons and shields. Even if they were no match for the swamp giants alone, dozens of them could still pose a threat to the swamp giants. The latter had steam cannons that could fire large-caliber shells. Even the strong swamp giants didn't dare to fight head-on. The balance is balanced again. Topulo communicated with his companions with his psionic ability. Only one powerful monster leader is still wreaking havoc. He should be the Tribulation General under the Emperor's command. We need to increase the weight and completely press down the scales of this war. From him, we might be able to decipher the secret of the Emperor's biological modification. We can build a larger and stronger army of monsters and then completely occupy the Ramsey Plain. The few demonic fish reached a consensus again and immediately put it into action. In a one-on-one battle, none of the demonic fish present was a match for Tribulation General. These intelligent monsters naturally had no intention of doing so. They were still used to hiding behind the front row and releasing their evil spells. Therefore, while Topulo was holding back the dog trainer, the other 5 seven-cheek counselors cast the anti-magic ray at the same time. 5 light blue beams of light shot out from the third eye on their foreheads, hitting the illusion of the Jodan troll that Tribulation had created earlier. Like a bubble being popped with a spike, the illusion made a poof sound and then disappeared without a trace. The 7 bearded councilmen, who had seized the silver chain from the amphibious demonic fish, ordered the Jodan trolls, "Go and fight that powerful monster." Under the effect of the spell, the Jodan trolls obeyed the orders of their new master. Its 9 ferocious crocodile heads opened at the same time and let out a silent roar. Then it ran as fast as flying towards the dog trainer who was bombarding Topulo with fireballs. The arms that seemed to be made of steel were wide open. The Jodan troll lowered its head and rushed over to hug Tribulation General by the waist. The 9 heads on its shoulders stretched out and fiercely bit the muscles of the dog trainer's upper body. Then it launched the most deadly death spin of the ferocious crocodile. Like a titan spring being released, the 9 crocodile heads quickly rotated and gnawed off 9 pieces of flesh flowing with magma and flames from Tribulation General's upper body. Damn it! After being severely injured, the dog trainer immediately changed his body state and turned into a complete lava elemental giant. Due to the change in nature, his body made of lava directly flowed down from the Jodan troll's embrace and was unbound. At the same time, with the help of the elemental incarnation, Tribulation also healed his injuries. "I will burn you to ashes." The dog trainer roared as he swung his arm and threw the flame whip out, instantly wrapping it around one of the Jodan troll's heads. Dying. Using his arm strength, he pulled the flame whip and pulled out one of the enemy's heads from his shoulder. The blazing flame immediately burned the head to ashes. However, the Jodan troll, who should have been severely injured, didn't seem to take this decapitation seriously at all. It just casually grabbed a large handful of snacks from the ground. There were monsters under General Tribulation's command, and some 4 monsters, and stuffed them into its other 8 bloody mouths. After chewing for a while, it swallowed them into its stomach. Immediately after, at the charred wound of the severed head, a large bag strangely bulged and ruptured. A brand new head broke out of the cocoon and grew to the same size as before, as if it had been filled with air. Seeing this, the dog trainer couldn't help but narrow his eyes. The current situation was somewhat disadvantageous to him. Apart from dealing with the Jodan troll in front of him, he also had to divert his attention to deal with those sinister demonic fish. If he was careless, he would repeat the same mistake as before. It was almost dusk, and the warm afternoon light had now turned into cold blue and purple. The frost and snow were like sharp blades, scattering over the dead forest. The slightly hot water vapor was hidden in the breeze and swept towards an army that was trekking. The 2 completely different atmospheres made almost everyone feel uncomfortable. They weren't very clear about the reason for this contradiction. However, they knew that they would become the 3rd factor to exert an effect on the environment in addition to the 2. The army temporarily stopped in front of the dam made of solidified magma. The few camel shamans at the front stepped out of the crowd. Each of them summoned their own totem pillars. "Spirit of the earth, please help us." Following the shaman's call, the earth and rocks in front of the dam began to rise, building a slope for the army that was about to enter the battlefield. Moreover, at the top of the slope, There was a platform made of rocks that could be used to clean up the army formation. The army formed by the Ramsey Human Alliance Army and the two land races of the island world slowly walked onto the platform. They saw the monsters and strange monsters that were about to reach the climax of the battle. They were old enemies, a wonderful combination. Chapter 754. The newly arrived legions launched a fierce attack. Because they were waiting at ease, unlike the monsters brought by tribulation and the monsters commanded by the demonic fish, they fought from afternoon to dusk, so their attacks were particularly fierce. The platform summoned by the camel spellcaster was very wide, so the Ramsey infantry could be arranged well on it. 5 military formations formed a layer, a total of 10 layers. They were the first wave to be thrown in as the vanguard. In order to fight against the monsters and those monsters, these infantry phalanxes, formed by the most elite warriors in the garrison forces of the various cities, could be said to be armed to the teeth. The armor, shields, and weapons they were equipped with were all the best of the best. Under the command of the phalanx commander, the phalanx infantry formed a hollow tortoiseshell with a curved double-layered tower shield, moving forward steadily and quickly. The soldiers in the front row held their axes and halberds horizontally in their hands. The infantry in the back all gripped their short swords and scimitars tightly in order to prevent the monsters from breaking into the formation. In the hollow inside, a team of archers and 2 or 3 alchemists were hidden as backup. They were like layers of waves, seemingly neither slow nor fast, but in fact, they carried an unstoppable force towards their opponents. On both sides of these phalanx infantry, there was a group of knights in a wedge-shaped formation following suit. Compared to the ordinary infantry who were already armed to the teeth, the equipment of these productive knights was even better. In addition to their shiny armor and sharp spears, their horses were also equipped with armor studded with iron plates. Since they had already reached the stage of battle, they naturally did not have to obey the order of silent march. The Ramsey army sang, the warriors' friendship as they marched, cheering for themselves, and, at the same time, trying to deter their opponents. However, in the face of such a mighty army, the monsters that were fighting fiercely seemed to deliberately ignore them and continued to bury their heads in fighting the opponents in front of them to the end. Whether it was the monsters or the monsters, they were now extremely lacking in effective dispatch. Their respective rulers were fighting desperately at this moment, and they had no time to manage these little brothers. The dog tamer was like a madman, desperately fighting with the Jodan trolls in a fierce hand-to-hand battle. The 10-armed octopus, the only monster in the army that had the ability to attack the air, had all been mobilized to help him. He used scorching rays and paralysis rays to attack the demonic fish at the bottom. If there were only 1 or 2 10-armed octopuses, the demonic fish definitely wouldn't care. If there were dozens of 10-armed octopuses, the demonic fish might just cast a magic shield on itself and survive. However, in the face of hundreds of 10-armed octopuses and thousands of scorching rays and paralysis rays, they did not dare let their guard down, even though these strange creatures had extremely high magic resistance. If there was no third army present, if the dog tamer was not a wedge keys inserted into the army of monsters, then there was nothing wrong with Tribulation General's approach. Unfortunately, the first 2 hypotheses were not valid. The reason why the hound tamer had mobilized the octopus was, firstly, to attack the demonic fish, and secondly, to reduce the threat of this spell-casting monster to Ramsey's army. Of course, the dog trainer was not the only one with such thoughts. When the demonic fish saw Ramsey's human army appear, a ripple appeared in their hearts. We don't have any conflict with Ramsey's humans at the moment. They might become our arms. However, the reality that appeared in the next second mercilessly crushed their little thoughts. Under the combined summoning of dozens of camel elemental shamans, the spirit of the earth responded to the call. Tall sandstone camels were formed from rocks and soil, and they launched an indiscriminate attack on the monsters and strange creatures that were stuck together. The polar bear elemental shamans were also unwilling to be outdone. They joined forces and prayed to the spirit of the air, successfully summoning a wind bear made up of wind and scattered sand and stones. It swept through the battle between the monsters and strange creatures. The island world's reinforcements hidden behind the Ramsey army also boarded the battle platform at this time. They shouted battle cries that the demonic fish found familiar, and they quickly attacked from both sides of the Ramsey army. This is a trap, Topulo thought in horror. Then, he involuntarily began to want to escape. After all, as a demonic fish that had lived for tens of thousands of years, this guy could be said to cherish his life very much. In fact, his companions had the same plan. However, the crazed Calamity General made it impossible for their plans to be implemented. If they wanted to use teleportation spells, the dog tamer had already cast a spatial lock on this area in advance. If they wanted to use their companions as cover to escape alone, the flame whip and the 10-armed octopus would focus fire on the demonic fish that tried to do so in the next second. Judging from the current situation, their only way was to quickly kill the Calamity General in front of them, and then quickly withdraw from the battlefield. This idea was undoubtedly good, but it was very difficult to operate. Facing a half-purgatory, half-elemental creature, many of the demonic fish's lethal spells were useless. The only thing that could restrain the other party was the fierce and tenacious Joe Dontroll. All they could do was be assistants, and at the same time, they had to be on guard against the concentrated fire of the 10-armed octopus. Just as the demonic fish were racking their brains to think of a plan, the Ramsey Alliance had already met the enemy. When they entered the range of the crossbow, the archers in the middle of the hollow formation immediately raised their heads and fired arrows. As long as the formation was not scattered, they, who were under the heavy protection of the infantry, could pour out their firepower with all their might. The halberd soldiers in the front row had already formed a wall with their shields. Their weapons stretched out from the gaps, either slashing or stabbing to cause damage to their opponents. They didn't care who they attacked. As long as it wasn't their own warriors, it didn't matter if it was a monster or a monster. All they could do was try their best to make the other party bleed. Some of the fish demons or evil crowmen relied on their astonishing jumping ability or their claws to borrow strength from the shield wall to climb over the shield wall in the front row of the phalanx infantry. However, just as they were about to launch a sneak attack on the vanguard soldiers who had their backs facing them, the warriors holding round shields in the inner layer of the phalanx would swarm forward and squeeze these escaped fish and crows together, using their short swords and scimitars to greet them. These enemies who were lucky enough to rush into the phalanx would soon be chopped into a pile of meat paste. Of course, whether it was the commander of the Alliance army or the captain of each army formation, they knew very well that human stamina was limited. In such a high-intensity battle, they would be exhausted in less than half an hourglass at most. Without additional support, it was impossible for the phalanx infantry to defeat monsters or monsters with astonishing stamina. Fortunately, the reinforcements they received were timely. Chapter 755. Led by Wolfgar, the polar bearmen and camel warriors charged out from the flank of Ramsey's human infantry formation at a speed faster than horses and collided with the monsters and monsters. Wolfgar let out a roar of challenge, holding a battle axe in each hand and chopping off the heads of a fish monster and a crow man. Then he continued to charge forward, pushing the twitching corpses towards the enemies behind him. The polar bearman tribal chief's son, who was like a small giant, waved his large axe, drawing out bloody arcs that symbolized death. In the blink of an eye, more than a dozen headless corpses fell behind him. Unlike the Ramsey humans, the polar bear men and camel men were two powerful races in the island world. Even the elemental shamans who were spellcasters would join the battle like the warriors. Moreover, their strength on the battlefield wasn't weak at all. A camel elemental shaman waved his totem pole, smashing the shell and body of a reef claw monster in front of him. At the same time, he took out some thorny seeds from his belt pocket, the kind of small balls that would hang on a person's clothes when they walked through the grass. He raised a handful of seeds in front of him and gently blew on them. The seeds instantly flew into the air as if they were swept up by a gust of wind. Their number instantly increased by 1,000 times, and they scattered towards the enemies around him, almost turning into a storm that covered the sky. Those ugly monsters howled and rushed into the dust of the seeds, only yearning to drink the blood of their opponents. But after running a few steps, the first unlucky guy who rushed to the front staggered and clutched his stomach. Soon, the second and the third also became like this. These guys were immediately cut down by the camel men and the polar bear men. Those who were still fighting could only resist for a moment or two, and then their stomachs and chests abnormally swelled. Dozens of dagger-like thorns pierced out of their bodies, penetrating their flesh and armor. Pus and screams came out of their mouths at the same time. They all suffered the same tragic fate. With the help of the spirit of nature, the camel shaman's seeds quickly took root and sprouted in these guys' bodies. Their bodies seemed to have become pincushions, full of thorns and branches that grew out of the seeds. Like a sharp sword, the Island World Support Group inserted themselves between the old enemy and the new enemy. Their charge had a better effect than the cavalry, and they ruthlessly tore apart the enemy's front. Of course, this didn't mean that they weren't blocked. In fact, just as they were about to penetrate the enemy's formation, this group with the intrepid Wolfgar as the arrowhead encountered a group of troublesome swamp giants. Although these mutants had low intelligence, they had extremely strong bodies. Ordinary camel men and polar bear men could only reach their chests, and their weight was only half of these monsters with their waists and stomachs. A shamans and camel men's and camel shamans and camel shamans and camel men and camel shaman. A few camel elemental shamans threw seeds at these monsters like before. Then, there seemed to be some special organs in their bodies that could secrete an extremely powerful digestive fluid, and the seeds of the spirit of nature had no effect on them. Just as the shamans waved their totem poles and wanted to summon other elements to attack, Wolfgar, who was leading the group, had already charged at a swamp giant. The large monster's halberd and the giant axe of the warchief's son collided, and both of them took a few steps back before stopping. However, judging from the monster's gurgling sound, it seemed to have felt a little frustrated. The halberd was broken, but the two steel axes were unscathed. The big monster suddenly opened its mouth and croaked like a frog again. A mixture of mucus and muddy water suddenly spurted out from its mouth and attacked Wolfgar's face. The son of the polar bear tribe's chief hurriedly placed a giant axe in front of him. The water arrow was blocked by the thick axe blade, making a chi-chi-chi sound. The axe blade seemed to have been soaked in acid. Croak. The swamp giant was clearly agitated. It casually threw away the broken halberd in its hand, and then smashed its two fists on the ground. The powerful force formed a shockwave that rushed along the ground towards Wolfgar, and the war chief fell to the ground. The large monster immediately rushed up, wanting to kill its opponent. But Wolfgar didn't let go of his weapon. The young but experienced warrior threw the corroded giant axe, hitting the swamp giant's cheek. Then he rolled to the side, stood up, and grabbed the other giant axe with both hands, and smashed it on the handle of the previous axe. With a poochie sound, the swamp giant fell to the ground with a quack sound while holding its head that was split in half. Wolfgar pulled out his weapon from the enemy's corpse, let out a provocative roar, and continued to charge at his next target. Finally, under the joint efforts of the war chief, camel warriors, and the elemental shamans, those powerful swamp giants were cleaned up. At this time, the wedge formation of Ramses' human heavy cavalry pierced through the formation of monsters and joined up with their allies. The successive heavy losses seriously damaged the enemy's morale. Whether it was the monsters or the monsters, they were all somewhat passive and afraid of fighting. They didn't dare to be in a stalemate with the main force of the Ramsey alliance that was advancing in a phalanx formation. These guys began to push each other while retreating in a direction where there was no opponent. The movement of the battlefield finally affected the fierce battle between the Calamity Generals and the demonic fish. Densely intertwined monsters filled the gap between them. Even though he had just completely killed and burned the Jodan trolls, the dog tamer still had a hard time catching the strange fish that he hated to the bone. He could only let out roars and continuously use his flame whip to kill the monsters that surrounded him. Taking advantage of this opportunity, the 6 seven-bearded councilmen immediately began to flee. They only brought a small number of armored monsters with them, and even the swamp giants were left behind on the battlefield. They had already made up their minds. As long as they left the area covered by the spatial lock, they would immediately launch a group teleportation and lead the existing army to the depths of the Ramsey Ocean to recuperate. Unfortunately, even though their little abacus was crackling, there were still some people who didn't forget about it. Topulo, who used float and haste to walk at the front, had just left the range of the spatial lock when his heart inexplicably tightened. The mucus that wrapped around him and helped him breathe began to boil in an instant, and the intense pain almost killed him immediately. A figure walked out of the void. The steampunk Demolic snapped his fingers, and the Snader's microwave oven enchantment he invented instantly doubled in size, shrouding all the monsters that had been dominating the ocean of the island world for a long time. Chapter 756. Electromagnetic waves that were invisible to the naked eye covered the entire area. Under its effect, the water molecules in the bodies of the demonic fish and the monsters began to vibrate violently. In an instant, they all felt their blood boil, and it was the literal meaning of the word. Then, it was as if someone had stuffed a large number of explosives into their bodies and then detonated them. These guys, one after another, bang, 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 bang. Every piece of flesh turned into a symbol of their own death. Led by Topulo, the 6 seven-faced counselors all tried their best to cast spells to save their own lives. While fighting against Snade's legendary spells, they desperately moved out of the electromagnetic radiation area. Prepare the teleportation spell. Through the psionic power, the demonic fish communicated efficiently. When we are out of the range of the Demolica's spell, we will escape, or strategic shift was not important. Because before they had time to say that word, a new danger suddenly appeared on their heads. With the whistling sound of tearing through the air, at least 24 shells loaded with delay fuses scattered on the heads of the demonic fish. And this was only the first round of test firing, just to warm up the barrels. More than 70 Hellscream were lined up on the dam in the distance. The busy private soldiers from other planes methodically completed the work of wiping the barrels, filling the barrels, and calibrating the elements. Key stood next to them, standing on the artillery position he chose. He had already thought of all this. The group of demonic fish would retreat, flee, and then crash into the Demolic Snade's magic barrier. Finally, because of the slow retreat plan, they would become the target of Hellscream's concentrated fire. And all he needed to do was to say, "Pour out the ammunition as much as you want." Brilliant flames ignited in clusters around the demonic fish. The loud sound and shock wave of the explosion soared into the sky, and the sharp shrapnel flew wantonly. In the end, death could come to the right place. Indeed, as a high-level monster that had ruled the various oceans of the island world for tens of thousands of years, the demonic fish were not without foundation. However, after the battle with the Tribulation General, the surprise attack by the Alliance army, and being baked by the microwave barrier, they had lost all their trump cards. The psychic ability and magical ability that he was so proud of could not hide the fact that his physical body was not strong. In the face of a cannonball, they might not be able to withstand it as well as those low-level mutants. For example, the armored monsters that looked like steam crabs were now orange-red in color. They relied on their thick carapaces, and if they were lucky, they might even be hit by a Hellscream. As their masters, no matter how powerful their spells were, they would be bitten by a giant shark if they were grazed by a cannonball. Even worse, if the cannons hit their bodies, those demonic fish would immediately be heavily injured. Cannonballs' flesh and blood flew in the air. The whistling of the cannonballs resonated with the miserable howls. After more than 10 rounds of bombardment, due to the sheer number of shells, the ground had been scraped several inches deep. Not a single monster was left intact. When the smoke dissipated, Keyes walked onto the bumpy land. In many of the craters, he saw the iconic dark blue blood of the demonic fish. However, he didn't see any complete body parts. "Clean up the battlefield," Keyes said with certainty as he looked back at Snade, who was following behind him. "Don't let any fish escape." The latter's skull, which was made of machinery and gears, shook up and down as a sign of agreement. As the steampunk Demolic began to chant a spell, the soil and gravel on the ground that had been plowed by the cannonballs began to churn. The bones and limited flesh of the mutant victims that had been blown into pieces slowly gathered together, as if they were being pulled by invisible threads. They ignored the effect of gravity and floated up to form a complete corpse. Jagged ribs protruded from the chest of the withered corpse, and clusters of churning souls were faintly discernible. A soul catcher was completed by the Demolic. Generally speaking, the conditions for the birth of such undead creatures were harsher. When a demon or evil spellcaster was lost beyond the boundless borders of the multiverse, it was only then that its undead remains could turn into a soul catcher that was utterly evil. Then, this undead creature would return to the material world with a twisted body, strange senses, and a thirst for life, full of resentment, bringing terror and pain to all souls until it was finally destroyed. However, for a Demolic that was almost at the top of the undead creatures, and this Demolic was also a legendary level spellcaster, it was much easier to create a soul catcher. Evil souls, broken bones, flowing blood, painful resentment. Just like that, a soul catcher or a small assistant was created. There should be no fish escape here, Snade repeated his employer's words. The newly born but extremely clever assistant did not hesitate and directly opened the ribs in front of his chest with his palm. On his chest, the lavender soul power was swirling and turning into the shape of a vortex. Like a walking vacuum cleaner in the shape of a human, the soul catcher walked through the land that had been baptized by the bombardment one step at a time. Monsters did not have their own beliefs, and the demonic fish were not qualified to worship gods. After they died, their souls would not dissipate so easily. Therefore, after the soul catcher completed its soul-stealing ritual, clusters of soul flames covered its chest. If one observed closely, they would see the souls imprisoned in the flames. Compared with the armored monsters, the souls of the demonic fish were undoubtedly much more solid, so their soul flames burned more vigorously. The 6 captured souls were directly hung on the soul catcher's ribs as if they were decorations. These small fries have finally become fish meat. The Demolic checked the accessories on his assistant and stretched out a finger of his mechanical artificial body. The power of dark corrosion suddenly burst out, and he casually cast a strengthened version of fear on the demon. Of course, this was not Snade's intention to torture the soul catcher. He knew the ability of this assistant. It could freely shift some spells cast on itself to the imprisoned souls in its body. Hearing the wails from the soul flames, the steampunk Demolic nodded with satisfaction. And we're the chopping block, the blender, and the juicer. We will squeeze some aged knowledge and information from these small fries. Chapter 757. This is just a small step for us, Keyes immediately said after meeting with Green, the commander-in-chief of the Alliance Army. After that, we still have to move forward. We can't stop until the protrusion is sunk into the sea. The Alliance Army did not waste any time. After the Hound Tamer retreated with the monsters from the flank, they quickly slaughtered all the monsters. The army played cymbals in celebration, and the Hunchback and Polar Bearman warriors also roared excitedly. Their voices were full of ecstasy and expectation. Their eyes began to greedily look in the direction of the monster army's retreat, like bloodthirsty wolves seeing lambs to be slaughtered. However, some people still maintain their rationality. I'm looking forward to that day. Personally, I really hope that day is tomorrow. Green saluted Keyes, but he also had some doubts. Although the army's morale is high, they are very tired. If we rashly march, will it? We are tired, and the monsters are tired, Keyes said, then continued to explain. The Alliance Army is composed of soldiers sent by many cities, and the Emperor is an army created by himself. He is not afraid of a war of attrition. Anyway, the destruction of Ramses' cities will not affect his strength, and Ramses' cities can't afford a war of attrition with him. He was telling the truth. The current situation of Ramses was somewhat similar to the famous Persian War, in Keyes' previous world. The relationship between the cities of Ramsey was like the city-states on the Greek peninsula, and the monsters pulled by the emperor were like the many slave armies of the Persian Empire ruled by Darius. Compared with the latter, the former did not have any advantage in human resources. Moreover, from Soft Maple City to the south, Emeraldwood City, the only city similar to the Hot Spring Pass, had long been removed by the emperor himself. As for the navy, although Dwarf Island was strong, it was not very reliable. It could be said that if Keyes did not change the situation, if he did not bring the Hunchback and Polar Bearman warriors, and if he did not put in Ifeltus, the Spartan traitor in the Battle of Hot Spring Pass, in the Emperor's monster army, the Ramsey Alliance army would not have been able to obtain a decent victory. Therefore, for Green now, Keyes' opinion was very important, because this was not only related to whether they could continue to cooperate, but also related to whether the Emeraldwood City he represented, the city that had been erased by the Emperor, could continue to be the leader of the city-states. In that case, let's set out at once. Under Keyes' strong suggestion, Green finally agreed to continue the march. He immediately sent out messengers to inform every phalanx leader that they would be leaving overnight. After cleaning up the battlefield, more than 30,000 soldiers of the Alliance army rested for an hourglass or so, and then were urged to embark on the journey by their commanding officer. Keyes asked Grimm to lead them to open up a path from here to the protruding point where the final battle would take place. No matter what you encounter, whether it's trees, monsters, or roaming bandits, use your blades and arrows to greet them. This was Green's order to the team leaders. They had to ensure that the road was unimpeded. Behind them, the troops recruited from the hinterland of Ramsey also began their journey. Because these soldiers had no experience fighting monsters before, they were not arranged to participate in today's raid. However, Green always thought, there are also some good guys. Even if they lack experience on the battlefield, transporting provisions and equipment will definitely not be a problem. As for the Island World Support Group, under the leadership of Wulfgar, the son of the great chieftain, they rushed to Red Pine City. It was located on the western coast of the continent. Previously, when eliminating the monster army, Keyes had hidden another backup plan, and now it was just the right time to use it. All the forces that could be unearthed in Ramsey for battle had been twisted into a rope. If they still could not resist the Emperor, then their future was afraid that there would be no future. Fortunately, that was not in line with Keyes' demands, so he had to do his best to get rid of the Emperor. This was not only because the scale of Perpetual Order had extended its tentacles to the Ramsey Plain and needed to start trading as soon as possible, but also because Keyes had felt some abnormalities in himself. He was afraid that he could no longer be called a young blue dragon. As a megalosaurus, he was about to enter a new age stage and become a young or adult megalosaurus. Although he was not sure whether there would be an evolution beyond the age stage, he was sure that he would have a period of dormancy. At least 3 to 5 months, and at most 1 to 2 years. At that stage, he would no longer be able to interfere in the affairs of Ramsey. The scale of Perpetual Order and the power of the local natives were not enough to fight against the Emperor. Whether it was the ancient slave master who had reconquered this plane, or the dwarf god who had defeated the Emperor and gained more influence in Ramsey, neither of these situations was the terrible situation that Quest wanted to see when he woke up from his hibernation. The offensive and defensive forces are different, Keyes thought as he stood on the flying carpet controlled by Snade and looked down at the troops marching through the night with torches in their hands. The seeds in Ramsey have been planted. It's time to get rid of the Emperor, the Tool Man. The night wind blew his robe, making it flutter. The flying carpet quickly drove to Red Pine City. The portal summoned by the demonic fish had been closed, but the salt marsh formed by the seawater had not yet subsided. The vanguard of the Alliance army was wading through the mud, and everyone felt that their feet were bound. Even the knights had no choice but to take off their armor. With the help of their attendants, they pulled their war horses and workhorses and trudged slowly through the dirty soup. All the alchemists in the army were gathered. They were responsible for mixing a kind of adhesive agent that was used to strengthen the city walls or fortresses. As for the reserve infantry, They had to pick up axes and shovels to chop down some withered trees and pile them together with earth and stone. After using the adhesive agent to reinforce it, they could build a path that could barely allow everyone to pass through. Their previous battlefield, the place where the monsters fought, was located near the ruins of Juniper Village. It was only a few hills away from the bombed soft Maple City, less than 20 miles away. However, when the army saw the abandoned city, it was already noon the next day. Trekking through the night almost exhausted everyone's physical strength. Standing on top of the hill and feeling the salty breeze from the ocean, Grimm immediately gave the order. Nobles and civilians, knights and infantrymen, everyone is to immediately participate in the construction of the camp on the Headwind Hill. The voice of the commander-in-chief of the Alliance army was hoarse, but his will was not worn down. Cutting wood, cutting firewood, repairing pots, cooking, and setting up sentries. Every job can't be taken lightly. Tomorrow, we're going to have a decisive battle with the Emperor. Chapter 758. Even though they were covered in mud, the camp set up by the Ramsey Alliance still looked clean and tidy. Inside the camp, surrounded by wooden fences, a town of tents rose up. In the middle of each group of tents was the commander's conical tent, with all kinds of conspicuous flags fluttering above its main pole. And in the center of the camp, the soldiers from Emeraldwood City solemnly set up the Green family's gold and green embroidered tent. This was the visual symbol of the Alliance's commander-in-chief's honor and dignity. According to custom, the engineers raised everything around the camp to the ground, in order to prevent enemies from secretly sneaking in, and at the same time to provide a wide shooting range for the sentry posts and the arrow towers. They also dug a trench parallel to the fences, and most of the excavated earth and rocks were filled in between the wooden fences. The rest was piled up behind the trench, and a low wall was built to obstruct the enemy from climbing over the trench. The organization of the camp was very meticulous, and each infantry phalanx raised its own banner, which not only provided a clear indicator for the commander to give orders, but also made it convenient for each phalanx's captain to manage the troops. As for the public facilities in the army, the first to be built were the cesspools. They were all properly arranged downwind of the camp to ensure that the more than 30,000 people wouldn't suffer the torture of the stench of feces and urine. Because they were marching in a hurry, this advanced group didn't bring much drinking water. But for safety reasons, Green didn't let the engineers dig wells or go to the river to get water. Instead, they boiled the drinking water and then distributed it to everyone. The following supply troops would bring supplies, including large water tanks pulled by mule carts. At dusk, many priests and missionaries would call out prayers from dozens of places in the camp, and this call lingered above the camp for a long time. The soldiers lit a bonfire, boiled dry food, and some meat into porridge, and ate it. Because it was during war, according to Ramsey's tradition, this was their only meal every day. The army was very frugal at the beginning of a battle. Therefore, every soldier, even the knights, ate very carefully, licking their plates clean. The smoke from the chimney drifted away with the wind. There were all sorts of noises in the camp. Murmured prayers, the hammering of mallets, the grinding of swords, the snorting and whinnying of horses, mules, and other beasts of burden, incessant to the ears. After half an hourglass had passed, these sounds had all disappeared. Or rather, only one sound remained. The entire camp was filled with snoring sounds. Almost everyone had fallen into a deep sleep, except for the commander of the army and the soldiers on guard duty. According to Ramsey's tradition, there were 3 types of sentries. The first method was to constantly patrol and guard the camp according to a preset route. The second type was at the top of the tall watchtower, overseeing everything in and around the camp. The third method was more difficult and dangerous. As hidden sentries, they had to leave the relatively safe camp and hide in the moist and cold trenches. Or even worse, they had to find their way to the open space around the camp and hide in the trees and grass. Soldiers who could serve as sentries not only had to possess tenacity, agility, and alertness, but they also had to possess powerful combat strength. They would not be quietly killed by the raiders or the monsters sent by the Emperor to clean up the hidden sentries during a night attack. Therefore, a group of Saint Samurai led by little Dalton took on this task without hesitation. These divine warriors from Hieronymus, Tom, and other temples were not like the imagination in some novels. They would shine wherever they went, although they could do this. In fact, for these warriors who had received the most rigorous training under the drive of faith, moving quietly under the night was not a test at all. They changed out of their reflective plate armor and put on lighter chain armor. Then they put on a layer of robes that could be used to keep warm and hide themselves outside the armor. They carried light weapons and quickly took their positions under the night sky. During the rapid march last night, they had received Green's notice. Therefore, these Saint Samurai were the only soldiers who had completed the march on horseback. They slept as they moved forward. Even when everyone was building the camp, they were also resting. It was for this moment. In the night, every Saint Samurai who served as sentries was in high spirits. The firm faith in their hearts made them fearless. A few hourglasses ago, they had eaten a full meal of meat porridge. Coupled with their strong bodies, they were not afraid of the cold of the night. In addition to the handy light weapons, every Saint Samurai also carried a crossbow. Of course, they did not rely on this thing to kill the enemy, but to be able to fire a whistling arrow in time to warn the camp and other companions when they found the enemy. All the Ramsey Alliance commanders, including Green, knew very well that the first night at the Headwind Hill camp would not be peaceful. Although the dog trainers had suffered a failure at the ruins of Juniper Village and lost a large number of monster legions. But as long as the Emperor did not die, then a large number of monsters could be quickly created again. This was almost their consensus. And the movement of the Alliance army building the camp certainly could not be hidden from the Emperor, who was close at hand, less than 30 miles away. After a day and a night, there was most likely a new batch of monster legions in his nest on the protruding headland. As long as he had a little bit of strategic knowledge, he should know that now was the time to constantly attack the Alliance army's camp to tire them out. And this was indeed the case. Although the situation was not as serious as Green and his colleagues thought, the Emperor was still busy resurrecting the Lord, because his divine spark was extinguished, so this work was much more difficult than resurrecting the other tribulation generals. There are not many monsters being created. The only ones that could be sent out from the protruding headland were the thousands of raven men led by the tribulation General Shirgu. No one will be able to sleep tonight. Looking in the direction of the Headwind Hill, Shirgu stood beside him and promised the dog trainer who had returned to his orc form, "I will make them feel more tired. Maybe, when you lead the team to attack their camp tomorrow morning, you will find that no one can still hold their weapons." His words were full of provocation. However, the war of words that Shirgu had expected did not break out. Although he wanted to use the reality of repeated failures to question his colleagues, the dog trainer did not pay attention to his words. The fangs at the side of his mouth twitched twice, and the dog trainer only responded with one sentence. "I wish you a successful night attack. Tomorrow's decisive battle. I will also save some energy." Chapter 759. The clear moonlight shone on the ground, adding a sense of desolation to this damp and cold land. Little Dalton clenched the hilt of his sword wrapped in cloth and stared ahead without blinking. About 10 breaths ago, he heard the rustling sound of branches swaying in the distance. Of course, because it could also be caused by the sea breeze or some birds or small beasts, he did not sound the alarm. But this did not affect his vigilance. Hiding in a crack of a broken rock near the hillock, little Dalton not only opened his eyes wide, but he also tilted his head slightly from time to confirm whether the sound was gradually approaching. Sure enough, something is happening. About 200 yards away, he saw a figure flashing through the branches of the trees. Little Dalton immediately judged that the other party was a raven man from its physical characteristics and movement pattern. A crossbow arrow stretched out from the crack of the rock. After predicting where the monster would land, the paladin immediately pulled the trigger. Then, without even looking to see if he had hit the target, he turned around and left his current hiding place. The air passed through the hollow shaft of the arrow, making a loud whoosh sound as it pierced through the air. The ear-piercing sound of this special whistling arrow could travel thousands of yards in the silent night. Regardless of whether it could succeed or not, little Dalton's goal of warning had been achieved. In the dense forest, several paladins hiding in the grass and branches all woke up and imitated the whistling arrows and the hand crossbows. Like beating drums and passing flowers, the ear-piercing sound rang out one after another, all the way to the big camp at the top of the windward hillock. As a reserve, the garrison immediately climbed up from behind the wall piled with mud. The captains of each phalanx of infantry also began to wake up their warriors. Although according to the plan to deal with the night attack, these soldiers who had worked hard for a day and night might not need to line up for battle tonight. After the monster appeared, they still had to maintain a minimum of vigilance. In case there was a need to fight, they would not rush to the front line while rubbing their sleepy eyes. To be able to defeat the dog tamer and Kai Tongtian's troops, this army of slaves seems to have some strength. Floating in the night sky, Tribulation General Shurgu thought to himself as he broke the bone bow in his hand. As a Tribulation General transformed by the Emperor through hunting corpses, Shurgu still retained some of his personality characteristics when he was undead. Like many undead creatures, he hated the living and loved to devour life. Moreover, the extremely ferocious Shredder would become very focused, or even fanatical, if he found a target strong enough to warrant a hunting competition with him. In particular, this target had once killed him, so Shurgu's desire to complete his revenge through hunting became extremely fervent. Even now, when he was clearly serving the Emperor, he could not help but make some small mistakes. Emeraldwood City Green. Muttering these two names, Shurgu trod on the air with his strange legs and soared into the air. Previously, in Emeraldwood City, he was forced into a corner by Green, who was controlling a drone, using the swarm tactics. In the end, he was beheaded by Keys. Because of the lack of information, Shurgu didn't know Keys' name, so he poured all his passion for revenge on the mayor of Greenwood City. At night, he was supposed to lead the Raven Men to attack the camp, but in the end, he came alone and wanted to kill. The Tribulation General had even prepared a hunting plan. Even if Green carried those drones in the dark as the commander-in-chief of the Alliance Army, he could not effectively see the target, and at the same time, he needed to take into account the changes in the situation on the battlefield. As long as he found an opportunity to shoot a death energy arrow, Shurgu was confident that he could complete the kill. At that time, not only would he have completed his revenge, but no matter how many Raven Men died, with the credit of killing the commander-in-chief of the Alliance Army, he would be able to suppress the other Tribulation Generals in front of the Emperor. Now, the key to the plan was those Raven Men. Don't let me down. Shurgu's eyes flashed with an almost imperceptible red light. The Tribulation General already knew that his subordinates were exposed, but it was not clear how long they could last. He knew very well that a night attack was similar to a siege. Even if it was the attacking side, they had to try to end the battle as quickly as possible. After all, the enthusiasm and expectation for the attack, as well as the willpower to fill the ravine with trampled corpses, actually had a strict time limit. Unexpected setbacks could quickly lead to a decline in morale. Even if they were all Raven Men, if the battle was not going well, panic, rumors, dissent, and dissatisfaction would quickly sweep through their hairy heads like a bird's nest. And if the Raven Men were to retreat, Shurgu knew very well that with the number of monsters in the monster army, they could not defeat so many Ramsey Alliance troops. Before, he could not mobilize the enemy's full strength, and Green did not personally go to the front line to command. Then he was afraid that he would not have the opportunity to shoot a death energy arrow to kill the commander-in-chief. With the help of a secret technique to hide his body, Shurgu stared at the camp on the Headwind Hill in midair. He witnessed the whole process of the Alliance Army's hidden sentries discovering the traces of the Raven Men, then retreating to the camp after firing the warning arrow, and finally meeting up with the defenders inside the camp. What a good rapid response force, the Tribulation General thought to himself. Although he did not know that the hidden sentries were actually paladins from various temples, from their vigorous movements, he could still see that these people were extraordinary. When the Raven Men appeared in the open space around the camp, because the Alliance army deliberately cleared the trees when setting up camp, they could no longer fly between the trees like before. The blazing fire glue thrown out by the alchemists was scattered all over the open space, burning fiercely. The fire illuminated the green eyes of the monsters, and at the same time exposed their bodies in front of the defenders. Archers, get ready. Green arranged an army composed entirely of longbow archers on the simple walls of the camp. This was one of the original families of Emeraldwood City. Each archer held a longbow up to 6 feet long, and the arrow range was as far as 300 yards. The leader of the Raven Men was a particularly strong tribal leader. He wore a helmet made of a giant bear's skull on his head and carried a heavy hammer with a saber-toothed tiger skull at the top in his hand. Seeing that the Alliance army's camp was ready, he instinctively wanted to give the order to retreat first, but he thought of Shurgu's threat before leaving. The leader of the Raven Men had to let out a noisy roar. All troops, attack! Between the heavy losses of the tribe and his own tragic death, there was no doubt that this evil creature finally chose the former. Chapter 760. The night wind blew the dark clouds together, as if there was a bump on the face of the sky. The ravens, on the other hand, followed their leader's instructions and charged towards Windward Hill's campsite. Or rather, they charged straight towards the campsite. This was their habit. They rarely followed discipline on the battlefield, and most of the time they relied on instinct. In order to safely cross the open space around the camp, all the crowmen ran as fast as they could. Facing them were the defenders of the Ramsey Human Alliance, who had basically rested and reorganized. They beat the leather drums and walked towards the flutes and cymbals. The flames were bright, and the shouts were continuous. Everyone who was still conscious had their weapons ready. Although they lacked defensive equipment, the longbowmen from Emeraldwood City, as well as the fences and trenches that the army had erected during the day, made up for this shortcoming. And unlike most of the time, the monster army that came to attack at night was obviously not enough. The 3,000 crowmen were not even 1/10 of the total number of the defenders. Even though they were savage, the morale of Ramsey's soldiers was at its peak after their victory. Sharpshooters sniped the larger monster leaders. All archers, get ready, shoot at will. The captain of the longbowmen, standing behind the fence, loudly ordered. He was a hunter from Emeraldwood City, and he had a pair of beast-like eyes. The night almost didn't affect his vision. After giving the order, the captain quickly locked on to the target, which was an enemy leader holding a tiger skull hammer. Whoosh! Like moving clouds and flowing water, a 4-foot-long heavy arrow was shot out from the longbow. The sharp diamond-shaped arrowhead pierced through the enemy's flesh and embedded itself in the gap between the bones of the crowman leader. After being hit, the leader of the evil crowmen let out a miserable howl. But before he could pull out the arrow from his shoulder, the sharpshooters who found this suitable target sent more arrows in front of him. Seeing this scene, the crowman leader's heart hardened. He directly used his beak-like mouth to bite the arrow shaft, and then used the saber-toothed tiger teeth at the top of the hammer to hook a nearby companion. He hung the companion in front of him as a shield to avoid the arrows. Puff, puff, puff. The unlucky guy who was used as a meat shield soon stopped yelling. Like a piece of dried meat hanging from a beam, he kept swaying in front of the tiger skull hammer. In fact, in the process of the evil crowman's mad dash, such a scene was not an exception. Even though many of the Raven Men were equipped with simple wooden shields, they were still used to using their companions to solve their problems due to their evil nature. But it was also because of this that the Raven Men's formation was scattered. In addition, their sprinting speed was very impressive. It would take them at most 20 breaths to run 100 yards across the empty field. Therefore, after 3 rounds of shooting, not many Raven Men were killed. Sharpshooters continue shooting. The rest of you retreat. Swordsman and shield wielder, prepare to attack. The longbow captain cautiously gave the order. Although the longbowmen had outstanding arm strength and were qualified warriors when they picked up a long sword, it was not wise to let this precious force get involved in a melee battle. More and more enemies climbed over the trench. These wingless birdmen had obviously learned their lesson. Only a very small number of evil crows leaped up, wanting to jump over at once. However, because they could not change direction when they were suspended in the air, they became the target of the sharpshooters. Of course, Ramsay's defenders did not want the enemy to get close so easily. Along the fence, there was a watchtower every 100 steps. In addition to the lookouts, there were also 2 alchemists working. They were holding a siphon nozzle connected to a hand pump. One was responsible for pressing the nozzle, while the other was responsible for shooting. The substance extracted from the black oil produced in Ramsay's natural oil well was shot out from the nozzle, forming a long fire snake. The powdered resin mixed and gave the liquid an extremely strong adhesiveness. The alchemists mainly aimed at the trenches. Any Raven men who wanted to climb over this defensive line would have to experience a burning flame. If they were unlucky, some flames would stick to their bodies. The smart ones quickly rolled on the ground and extinguished the flames. The less smart ones directly turned into a bunch of torches while howling. However, after climbing over the trenches, even the Raven men who were lucky not to be touched by the flames had to face a new test. Around the camp on Upwind Hill, there was a 15-foot-high wooden fence. The gaps were filled with soil, gravel, and adhesive. Even if the Raven men were a relatively strong race, they could not smash the fence and break in with brute force. So, in the end, these monsters had to climb over again. If there were no defenders, relying on the sharp claws, this barrier would not be a problem for the Raven men. But now, Ramsay's soldiers were standing behind the fence. Every time a Raven man appeared above the fence, they would be blocked, stabbed, or smashed down by the halberds. The few that succeeded in climbing over began to attack the defenders. They wanted to disrupt their formation and tear a hole in the defense of the wall. But the swordsmen would immediately squeeze them in the middle and work together to cut the Raven men into minced meat. Don't panic. Everyone pay attention to preserve your strength. The captains who organized the defense behind the fence were basically repeating this sentence to their subordinates. The advantage was obvious. It was only a matter of time before they won. The leader of the Raven men, who was wearing a bear helmet, leather armor, and holding a tiger skull hammer, finally climbed over the fence. In the span of a few dozen breaths, his body was first hit by an arrow and then burned by fire. His current appearance was more or less miserable, but he was still fighting with all his might. However, this was not because of bravery, but because of fear. In fact, since he pulled out the arrow from the wound, he had already thought of retreating. But Tribulation's cold voice suddenly appeared in his heart. Death is far from the end. The threat of Shurgu made the leader of the Raven men feel cold all over. He had to muster up his remaining courage and continue to fight with all his might. Compared to the ordinary Raven men, he, as the leader, was much taller and stronger. Although he was slower than the younger Raven men because of his age, his experience and skills made up for this shortcoming. He waved a heavy weapon that only a few warriors could use and attacked the Ramsay defenders around him at all costs. He wanted to clear out some places for the other Raven men to stand. A swordsman slashed his shoulder. Because of this blow, he groaned, but he quickly swung his hammer to counterattack. The shield-bearer nimbly took a step back, but the crow-bearer held his weapon in a reverse grip and swung his war hammer upwards. The saber-toothed tiger's fangs at the tip of the war hammer hooked onto the shield-bearer and sent him flying. Bang! The hammer hit the shield-wielder's chest, causing the chest of the chainmail warrior to cave in. After climbing over the wooden fence, this was the first human he killed. Then the second, the third. In the end, the leader of the Raven men relied on his powerful combat strength to complete his plan and clear out a space. A large number of Raven men poured in through this gap. Grim, who was watching the battle, saw a gap in the defense line and waved his hand fiercely. Paladin Tom, who was guarding beside him, hurriedly led a reserve team and rushed toward the leader of the Raven men. And this scene made Shurgu, who was high in the sky, reveal a grim smile. Then the hunt begins. Chapter 761. The cold arrow slowly formed on the bowstring, and the evil death energy gradually condensed. Shredder aimed at the man in the dark green armor and released the bowstring. Because he guessed that the monsters would attack at night, Grim did not rest for a moment. He had been sitting in his tent, waiting to command the battle. As the defending side, the Union Army had the advantage. In fact, the performance of the Raven Men at the beginning did indeed prove this point, until their leader broke through the defense line. However, this did not surprise Grim. If these monsters were so easy to deal with, then Ramsey's soft Maple City and Emeraldwood City would not have been captured. In this regard, he already had a plan. 2 black-clothed and black-armored guards led a small group of guards from the Green family to the front line to fight against the leader of the Crowmen, who was quite powerful. Shouting the holy name of the god of loyalty, the 2 Tom Paladins attacked the opponent from both sides. The guards began to cut off the small soldiers around the Raven Men leader. Because the weapons were sharper and the armor was stronger, these warriors always had an easier time killing a Raven Man at a lower cost. In the face of monsters, they would not rely on luck, and they would not be afraid of bullying with numbers. The Raven Men leader, who was wielding a tiger skull warhammer, was constantly harassed by the 2 paladins. In just a few short breaths, the long sword pierced through the bone armor on his body more than once. The monster's blood spilled and finally fell on the city wall. The black-armored paladins cut off the Raven Men leader's head. Grabbing the feathers on his head, he stuck it on the wooden fence and used it as an example to the public. His and the other Raven Men's corpses were thrown into the burning trench by the crowd. Standing at the entrance of the tent, Grim watched the monsters on the city wall being defeated again. Only then did his heart return to his stomach. Next, dealing with the night attack would only take some time. However, just as he was about to turn around and return to the tent, Grim suddenly felt a chill down his spine. It was the same feeling he experienced when he was attacked by the hill giant hiding behind the oak tree during the coming-of-age ceremony more than 10 years ago. Without hesitation, this Union Army soldier did not care about his image in front of the soldiers. He lay down on the ground and quickly rolled to the side. This decisiveness saved his life. An arrow with a dense aura of death brushed past the edge of his dark green armor and sank into the ground. All the weeds within a 2-yard radius instantly withered. Assassin. The guard of the Green family quickly moved. They raised their shields and used their shields and their own bodies to protect the Patriarch in layers. They surrounded the Patriarch in an airtight encirclement. The Tribulation General, who was high in the sky, frowned. His pale face, which was similar to that of Ghoul, suddenly dimmed a little, and his eyes glowed red. "You're dead meat today, I said so." Using advanced teleportation, in a flash, Shurgu appeared next to the tent of the commander of the Alliance army. If they couldn't hit their prey with their arrows, hunters would sometimes choose to fight with their bare hands. Shurgu's 2 strange legs, which seemed to be wrapped in skin and flesh, kicked the ground. Every time he kicked, he would be able to move 4 or 5 steps. He held the bow and bow in his hand in a reverse grip and continuously used the bowstring to swipe at the throats of the Green Guards. With a tug and a pull, a life was taken away. The Tribulation General's attacks were like the autumn wind, and the soldiers collapsed to the ground like fallen leaves. The entire Headwind Hill camp was roused from their stupor. Not only the black armored guards who had just killed the Raven Men, but the infantry and even the knights who hadn't had time to put on their armor were all desperately rushing to the commander's tent. They had to stop the Tribulation General. "Accept your death, lambs." Shurgu brandished his bow and bow. In the next second, it would fall on Green's neck. He was very confident in his strength and the tenacity of the bowstring. He was confident that he could cleanly cut off the head of this enemy. Rip, crack. The first was the sound of the bowstring being cut by a sharp blade. The second was the sound of the bowstring smashing into the blade. At this moment of imminent peril, a 6-foot-long and palm-wide forged steel sword shot out from the side, blocking the Tribulation General's weapon and Green's path. Fortunately, I came in time. A person wrapped in thick plate armor fell from a height of dozens of yards and smashed a shallow hole in the ground of the camp. So, this is your misfortune. His words were not passionate, but they were full of confidence. Because Johnson was very clear that the great power of kindness in the multiverse was always watching over him and was willing to provide help to a paladin like him. So, no matter what kind of enemy he faced, he had the confidence to rush up and fight. Holy shackles! He stretched out his hand and aimed at the forged steel sword that was inserted into the ground. The gem that was inlaid on the hilt was produced from the 6th floor of Mountain Paradise, the splendid paradise of Yoa, and it emitted a brilliant light. The light and the dense holy power on the paladin's hand reflected each other's brilliance, forming a shackle visible to the naked eye, trapping Shurgu in the light. Due to the repelling nature, the Tribulation General's already filthy body was burned, and the places where the light shone on had large scorch marks. Johnson raised his fist, wanting to completely end this evil life in front of him. You can't kill him like this. A voice came from behind the paladin. Ogre Brew, who had just landed, walked down from the flying carpet. Let me deal with him. It turned out that after Keyes led the Camels and Polar Bear men to split up with the Ramsey Alliance, he immediately issued the latest order to Brew, Nalu, the genius craftsman Shay, and the paladin Johnson, who were debugging the Storm Mecha and trying to copy it. Because he was worried that the Emperor would send Tribulation General or even personally attack the advance force of the Ramsey Alliance. He asked his partners to bring the research results of these days and rush to the Headwind Hill to reinforce it. The brawny Ogre Nalu and the genius craftsman Shay were now driving a Leviathan airship with a Storm Mecha that was ready to join the battle. Brew and Johnson arrived first on the flying carpet. Tribulation General can't be killed by ordinary means. Brew opened the food box that never left his body and took out a leather bag. He opened the lid and poured some jelly-like food into his mouth. We have to seal him first and let the professionals deal with him. As he spoke, he swallowed the food down his throat. Brew activated his synesthesia ability. The food gave the ogre the feeling of a gourmet, allowing him to easily complete a complicated spell structure. Brew clapped his hands, and a large amount of glue-like substance instantly formed spontaneously in the air and then sprayed toward Shurgu, who was bound by the holy shackles. Soon, the Tribulation General was covered by a translucent gel. The gel quickly dehydrated and formed an amber-like substance, sealing the Tribulation General firmly in it. You stay here and wait for Nalu and Shay. I'll take the flying carpet to find Snader and Paru to deal with this captive. The Ogre Gourmet reached out with his muscular arms and picked up the amber, which was as big as a man. He tied it to his flying carpet and tied it securely to his feet. Then he said goodbye to Johnson again and flew into the sky. Chapter 762. On the anchorage outside Red Pine City, a large number of workers and herds of bulls were placing warships on racks. Then, with the help of pulleys, they moved them onto wooden rollers on the rails. The rollers had been lubricated with grease beforehand. The ropes were taut, and the overseers in charge of supervising this work rode back and forth on their horses, looking serious and solemn. Within 2 months of the establishment of the Ramsey Human Alliance, Quest spent a large amount of gem coins in the name of the Scales of Eternity Chamber of Commerce. He bought a large amount of wood, steel, rope, canvas, tar, and artillery shells from all over Ramsey at a price that exceeded the value of the price. These materials were all gathered in Red Pine City, and a dozen shipyards were built. For 2 whole months, the city was filled with the ear-piercing sounds of saws, hammers, axes, and anvils being hammered. The black smoke from the large pots of asphalt, the smell of rotting animal fat, and sawdust mixed together, causing the citizens of Red Pine City to suffer unspeakably. Fortunately, the shipyards had completed their work before their patience reached its limit. The hulls began to take shape from the keel. The carpenters installed the decks, masts, and cannons, while the riggers began to assemble the sails. The logistics of preparing for the battle involved the entire city. Even the bakeries were busy producing biscuits that had to be baked twice. Thanks to the generous rewards, the advanced tools of the Scale of Perpetual Order, and the cooperation of the spellcasters, Red Pine City's production capacity was fully unleashed. In the last 3 days of the 2-month construction period, a total of 30 warships with keels of 50 yards long were pushed into the harbor outside Red Pine City. The ones in charge of controlling the cannons on the ships were all veterans of the scale of perpetual order. They had all experienced the bloody front lines of the abyss and could control Hellscream to deal devastating damage to the enemy. As for the other crew members, each ship carried a 100-man team of camels or polar bear men. They were responsible for landing or fighting on the ships. The day after the great victory at Juniper Village, the army was about to leave Red Pine Harbor and set out for the soft Maple Sea area north of Ramsey, which had already fallen into enemy hands. Keyes boarded his Leviathan. The stern of the ship was hung with symbols representing the authority of the Navy. 3 huge lanterns, a flag with a blue scale pattern fluttering on the top of the mast, and a complete ancient brown dragon head on the bow. This ship was called Nefmin Dis, named after the leader of the Megalosaurus warriors who had been sent by the Penishade dragon Queen Tiamat to kill Keyes in the Ashen World. And now, he was still a leader. The existence of this giant warship was a reminder to everyone that if they were to become enemies with the unbelievably powerful Megalosaurus, they would have to be prepared that they would not be able to rest in peace even after death. The ancient brown dragon opened its mouth and roared. All the fleets opened their sails, extended their oars, and put away their anchors. They followed the beautiful waterline behind the Nefmin Dis and sailed out of the harbor of Red Pine City. When they reached the wide open sea, they formed a straight line and headed north in groups. They stayed close to the coastline and moved forward at a constant speed of about 15 knots. If there were no other circumstances, this fleet could reach the sea area controlled by the Emperor in 2 days. However, Keyes felt that time was precious. He was ready to launch a pincer attack on the protrusion with the Ramsey Alliance's army. Activate the hydrofoil mode. We need to reduce the time needed to travel. With his order, the fleet led by the Nefmin Dis bulged out a muscle-like texture on both sides of each ship. The flesh and blood of the Leviathan living inside the ship actively changed its form to complete the orders given by its creator. First, the texture appeared, then it widened and elongated into 2 wing-like components that protruded into the sea from the side of the ship. On the bottom deck of the ship, the biological internal combustion engine formed by the flesh and blood of the Leviathan began to work. By consuming the filled black oil, it produced a strong power that drove the propellers below the deck to rotate rapidly, greatly increasing the ship's speed. 15 knots, 20 knots. When the speed reached 30 knots, these ships were all lifted out of the sea by the hydrofoil, reducing the friction with the water. Finally, the speed of the ships reached an astonishing 70 knots. They carried more than 3,000 elite soldiers, 1,000 Hellscream cannons, and enough artillery shells for 10 shooting bases. They swept across the sea like they were flying. The flagship of the Nefmin Dis raised its dragon head high and looked down at the sea as it braved the wind and waves. It emitted the unique aura of a dragon lord, causing the sea creatures within a few nautical miles to automatically retreat to prevent them from bumping into the high-speed ships and causing trouble. With the hydrofoil mode, the fleet of 30 ships arrived at the sea area north of Maple City in half a day. At this time, the moon had already climbed to the top of the sky. The cold sea rippled, looking mysterious and cold. Standing in the captain's room of the Nefmin Dis, a huge crystal ball with a diameter of 1 yard floated in the air. Keyes reached out his hand and stroked the surface of the crystal ball. A ferocious and ancient brown dragon appeared in it. Nefmin Dis, the young blue dragon, softly said the name of the Megalosaurus. Your power is mine to use. The brown dragon opened its mouth and let out a silent roar. The soul of the Megalosaurus that was imprisoned by a secret technique was helpless, but could not resist the will of this powerful junior. In an instant, the crystal ball was filled with fine, sand-like light spots. Then, these light spots jumped out like wisps of smoke and dust and entered the giant ship made of flesh and blood of the Leviathan. The hydrofoils on both sides of the Nephman disc had been retracted. It quietly rose and fell with the sea waves. And as the soul of the ancient brown dragon used a spell-like ability, brown scale-like patterns gradually appeared on the side of the ship. Then, the scales made of flesh and blood of the Leviathan gradually swelled and fell off, falling into the shimmering sea below. At the same time, the crew on the flagship also got busy. Amen threw boxes of wrought iron spears that were packed in crates into the sea. The locations where they were thrown were all accurately predicted, right next to the seabed where the scales fell. Half an hourglass had passed, and the scales that fell off the seabed had disappeared. In their place were humanoid creatures that were more than 6 feet tall. Their skin was made of dragon scales, and their bodies were filled with fine sand drawn from the seabed. They were the most elite royal guards of the ancient brown dragon empire, the Pharaoh's blades. Ka. The crates containing the wrought iron spears were opened one by one, and the Pharaoh's blades picked up their weapons. They all turned towards the direction of the beach and advanced on the seabed with uniform steps, forming the vanguard that Keys used to land on the beach. Chapter 763. When they walked out of the sea, each of the Pharaoh's blades raised their megalosaurus, like heads, and discharged seawater from the fine sand that made up their bodies. The weapons in their hands had been used and were stained with the blood of many monsters. Just as Keys expected, these constructs, which were originally used by the Nephman disc to guard the mausoleum and the palace, were also good at landing on the beach. The skulls and reef-clawed monsters that were kept in the soft maple bay by the Emperor could not stop the Pharaoh's blades at all. Through the connection built by the scales, the Pharaoh's blades could continuously replenish the energy provided by the ancient brown dragon soul. Not only could they use spears skillfully, but they could also spit out scorching sand, and the damage caused by the opponent could be completely recovered in an instant. Unless they were destroyed at once, they could continue to fight. The Pharaoh's blades broke through the ice in the bay and crawled out of the ice hole one by one. They then silently moved forward to the ruined, soft maple city. They built a beachhead on the breakwater and communicated with the fleet outside the bay. All forces attack. Walking to the top of the stern, Keys gave the order to more than 30 ships. Under the effect of magic, his voice was clearly transmitted to the ears of every soldier. Whether it was the camels from the island world, the polar bear men, or the otherworld soldiers from the bloody front line, they were all warlike races in nature. So when they heard the order, they all became fired up. Under the lead of the Nephman disc, every ship pulled up their sails, stretched out their oars, lowered their propellers, and charged straight into the soft maple bay. The laborers working on the lower deck poured buckets of black oil into the biological furnace. The flesh and blood of the Leviathan that received an abundant supply of energy quickly mutated and reorganized. Their bows all became icebreakers. They rushed onto the sea ice and crushed it with their weight, then continued to sail forward. During this period, although some monsters wanted to get close to the fleet, the enthusiastic crew used guns and cannons to entertain those who overestimated themselves. Without the command of the general or the emperor, the attack of the monster army became chaotic and obviously could not compete with such a fleet. After about a third of an hourglass, more than 30 ships had all sailed into the bay and lined up against the breakwater on the edge of the pier, protecting the beachhead built by the Pharaoh's blades. Except for some crew members who had to maintain the operation of the Leviathan's biological furnace and use guns and hellscream to deter the monsters, the rest of the crew carried their weapons and landed on the breakwater of Soft Maple City. The original North Wind Tavern had become the defense corps of Keys's army. The elemental shamans who came with the ships erected totem poles nearby could summon walls of granite. The Pharaoh's blades were easy to defend, but difficult to attack. In less than 2 hourglasses, they had built a small fortress that was easy to defend but difficult to attack. During this period of time, the blades' Pharaohs and others, ants. They wanted to attack the unfinished fortress, but they were all stopped by the Pharaoh's blades. These elemental creatures with dragon heads, wrapped in ancient brown dragon scales, and composed of sand and stone, completed their mission meticulously. Any monster that was hit by their breath would be burned the first time. The second time, it would become slow and fragile. The third time, it was a tragedy, as the monster would become a dry corpse in extreme pain. Moreover, they were good at using the weapons in their hands. The heavy spears made of wrought iron were wielded by the pharaoh's blades. Even if the monsters were not hit by the breath, they would be pierced and flattened by the weapons. The target is the protrusion. The fortress had been built, so Keys changed the order to the pharaoh's blades. Go and wipe out all the living things there. Nefermindis's dragon soul flashed in the crystal ball, and the pharaoh's blades immediately changed direction and began to move from the ruins of Soft Maple City to the protrusion. As for whether the pharaoh's blades could complete the mission in the end, Keys did not have much hope. However, he didn't place his bets on them. When the fortress was built, the polar bear men, the camels, and the soldiers from the other plane were ordered by Keys to repair it. After all, they were the main force that would attack the Monster Legion with the Ramsey Alliance's army tomorrow and completely destroy the protrusion. That night, everyone. Chapter 764. Like a giant lizard without wings, the ancient brown dragon crawled towards the protruding point of Soft Maple Bay. The pharaoh's blades followed him closely, guarding their king as they rushed towards the battlefield ahead. When he was defeated by Keys, Nefermindis's head was also blown apart. But later, because he was transplanted with the flesh of a leviathan, he obtained an intact head, just as ferocious as before. The brown dragon did not have wings, but there was a spine plate made of bones and skin on his back. As an ancient brown dragon, Nefermindis's spine plate had turned completely red, with lightning flashing on it from time to time. He dragged a long tail behind him, covered in spikes. As he moved forward, he plowed a deep gully in the ground. Seeing such a terrifying beast, the monsters that had gathered in the ruins of Soft Maple Bay almost popped their eyes out. They did not have the courage to rush forward, let alone fight him. And Nefermindis did not notice them at all. This ancient brown dragon had now completely turned into a leviathan. He would only listen to his creator, Keys. He only had one goal: insignificant emperor, suffer the wrath of the pharaoh. As he moved forward, strange ripples of energy continued to spread outwards. The hundreds of yards of land around him gradually turned into sand. The ruins and soil lost their moisture in the blink of an eye, turning into yellow sand. Nefermindis stepped on the ground and crawled forward at a speed faster than a galloping horse. His four limbs stirred up the sand around him, rolling up waves of yellow sand. They surged violently and slammed towards the protruding point. The emperor was alarmed. This ancient slave, Master Ramsey, had been busy rescuing the strongest calamity general exiled by the gods. However, at this moment, he suddenly felt a kind of valiant power suddenly appear beside his lair. Hound Tamer, he called. Soul Seeker, Cyclops, Panther Man, Earth God, Kaitong Tion, and Shurgu all had accidents one after another. He could only rely on this one calamity general. Wake up all the soldiers in the hatchery and buy me half a day's time. I want to reawaken the landlord god to help me in the battle. Hearing his master's order, the dog Tamer, who was still disguised as an orc, immediately changed into his true form. He walked down the protruding mountain peak in the form of an elemental half-purgatory creature. The monster army began to gather. At this moment, the magic energy in the incubation field gathered uncontrollably. The emperor adjusted the internal rune sequence of the magic circle and began to directly absorb the vitality contained in the surrounding environment. Within a radius of 15 kilometers, the temperature dropped again. Gray snowflakes were floating in the sky. Those plants and animals that did not die from being soaked in the salt water withered and died one after another. Even the sea creatures living in the Bay of Maple City were no exception. Their life force was extracted by magic and poured into the various vesicles in the hatcheries. The monsters that were still developing were rapidly matured and then broke out of their egg sacs. Their limbs touched the ground, and they spontaneously walked behind the dog trainers to the front line. The distance between Maple City and the protruding point was only a dozen miles. Nephrem Dis crawled at full speed, but it only took him a few dozen breaths. As a magical creature, he felt the violent magic elements in the air and knew that the enemy was ready to counterattack. It just so happened that he also wanted to end the battle quickly. Forbidden spell, Desecration Dragon Coffin. The ancient brown dragon whispered a spell in the dragon language. Then there were two loud bangs. Two violent explosions suddenly occurred on the sand beside him. Sand splashed and blocked everyone's sight. When the dust settled, two huge coffins stood upright beside Nephrem Dis. There were no decorations on them, and they were made of large pieces of rock, just like two small mountains. Open. When Nephrem Dis said softly, the lids of the two coffins fell forward at the same time, revealing the corpses that held the coffins. They were the remains of two megalosaurus. One was called Cusilian, and the other was called Gurgo. The former was the brown dragon that once seized the blue dragon's nest in the Ash World and was skinned by Keys. The latter was the black dragon gladiator that received Tiamat's order and was led by Nephrem Dis to ambush Keys. Both were dead and were made into undead creatures by the half-lich Snade. However, because Cusilian was weaker, he lost more flesh and blood. In the end, he was only pieced together into a skeleton of a plundering undead dragon. As for Gurgo, whose body was as fat as an oversized pig, he was made into a mummified megalosaurus after spending a lot of shrouds. At this moment, they all responded to Nephrem Dis' call and woke up to fight for their original enemy, their current master. There was no unwillingness. Treat death as a gift and give it to the creature in front of you. Nephrem Dis whispered maliciously. The plundering undead dragon Cusilian was the first to climb out of the coffin. This pale, undead creature no longer had the appearance of a brown dragon. There was a pair of huge, lidless, pure white spherical eyes on his head. Many rib-like bones protruded from his head and shoulders. His mouth was more like the beak of an axe beak, and there were 3 rows of long, bony ridges in place of teeth. Hundreds of extremely tiny bone lights grew from his back all the way to the small bone wings with a membrane, and were equally distributed on his body in a mysterious way. A nauseating stench was emitted from his body, and pieces of damp soil were dripping from his body. The mummified dragon Gurgo followed closely behind. This undead megalosaurus was originally an abnormally fat female black dragon. Even though she had died once, it did not lessen her shocking amount of fat. The curved dragon horns were concave forward, like the short but thick horns of a bull. Now, her body was wrapped in shrouds, and the shrouds were covered with black traces of corpse fluid. They charged forward with an unstoppable momentum and crashed into the monster army in front of them. They used their sharp teeth, claws, and thick tails to kill, enjoying the pleasure of taking the lives of the weak. Until the Hound Tamer joined the battle. At this moment, the lower half of the Calamity General's body had turned into flowing lava, and his burnt offering devil's upper body was emitting thick smoke. He did not use Darapotter's skull to cast an illusion, but chose to transform the flame whip into a giant sword, and engaged in close combat with 2 undead megalosaurus. Every time he swung his sword, he would let out a deafening roar, and, at the same time, try to drag his opponent into the lava. Chapter 765. The Hound Tamer tried his best to inflict wounds on the 2 undead megalosaurus. Every time the flame greatsword slashed, it would leave a scorched mark on the opponent's body, and the blazing flames would pour into the wounds. The plundering undead dragon, Cathilian, was the first to give up. His skeletal body began to crumble. Without any intention of cooperating with his companions, he decisively retreated, leaving Gurgo to fight the Calamity General. At this moment, a bolt of lightning suddenly struck him from behind. The electric current wasn't too strong, but it still caused Cusilian's body to shudder. "I will keep an eye on your back," Ferman Dis, the ancient brown dragon, suddenly roared in Draconic. Due to the restriction of the spell, the plundering undead dragon, could not attack his summoner. Moreover, the special lightning would make his body that had died once feel a soul-deep pain. So he could only continue forward. Nay, with a roar similar to the neigh of a war horse, but many times louder, Cathilian opened his horrifyingly large mouth that resembled the beak of an axe. This megalosaurus, made of bones, suddenly had a large piece of his sternum collapse, and a large amount of liquid spurted out from his mouth. Before he was turned into an undead creature, he was originally a brown dragon that was about to break through the old age, so Cathilian could use his powerful acid breath to attack his opponent. However, he did not have time to use it in close combat before he retreated. Now is the time. The plundering undead dragon's conical spit covered the Calamity General's body, and even Gergo, who was fighting with it, was caught in it. The acid extinguished the magma and turned it back into solid rock. Roar, although Gergo was a black dragon before she was turned, so she was not hurt by the acid, she still let out an angry roar. As a former Megalosaurus fighter and a powerful legendary black dragon, she had rarely been in such a sorry state. Gergo wriggled her fat body and turned towards the plundering undead dragon. Her ghostly green eyes emitted a cruel glint. Had she not been stopped by Nefermendis, she would have been more than willing to tear Cassilian to shreds before killing the dog tamer. Seeing this, the plundering undead dragon let out a hoarse roar and pounced at the hound tamer from another direction. That was the name of this cunning bastard. Only by quickly ending this enemy would he be rewarded by the summoner and escape from the jaws of Gergo. However, the little incident between the two undead Megalosaurus created a little opportunity for Tribulation General. Originally, because the lava in the lower half of the body had been extinguished by the acid, the dog trainer had temporarily lost the ability to move. However, he took advantage of that brief moment to transform the flaming sword in his hand into a spear and stabbed it into the ground, extracting heat from the earth veins to heal himself. Stop! The hound tamer used his two arms to prop up Gergo's upper and lower jaws, preventing the black dragon from biting him. Facing Cassilian, who was attacking from the other side, he opened his mouth wide and spat out a blazing lava breath, using the lava elemental's body to absorb the heat from the earth veins, and then using the part of the burnt offering demon's body to mix in the foul power of hell. The hound tamer's breath suddenly shot out like a volcanic eruption. The plundering death dragon staggered from the impact, and its huge body smashed into the ground with a bang. Mixed with hellfire that could burn souls, the front half of its body burned fiercely, causing it great pain. Seeing that his opponent had temporarily lost the ability to move, the hound tamer immediately turned his neck and prepared to use a mouth-to-mouth lava breath on Gergo, so as to incinerate this Megalosaurus mummy from the inside. However, Nefermendis, who had been watching from the sidelines, brazenly made his move. Although due to age, this ancient brown dragon's body was no longer robust, but his attainments in magic had become increasingly exquisite and lethal. Chapter 766. Fet. Sar. Nefermendis chanted the word Fet in Draconic. He then took a deep breath and finished chanting the second half of the incantation. The prepared incantation was instantly formed and shot towards the hound tamer who was about to kill the two undead Megalosaurus. This incantation was very powerful. It could remove all the oxygen in the target area in a short period of time and create an oxygen-free environment where flames could not continue burning. The flames that Calamity spat at Gergo only produced a few sparks before vanishing. Following that, the two front claws of the immemorial brown dragon heavily slammed on the ground, causing the sand around it to float up. The sand was like locusts searching for food as they rushed towards the hound tamer's lower body made of lava and covered it in layers. Not long after, half of Calamity's body was completely buried by the fine sand, and its movements were greatly restricted. Taking advantage of this opportunity, Gergo not only immediately broke free from the hound tamer's grip, but also bit down on one of the hound tamer's thick arms. This mummified megalosaurus that was abnormally fat had now turned into a crocodile that had bitten down on its prey. She tried to use the death roll movement to increase the damage of her bite, and it was indeed effective. Under the constant twisting and biting, a large piece of the hound tamer's shell-like arm was torn off by Gergo, and that piece of half-solidified lava-like flesh was swallowed by the mummified megalosaurus. She did not seem to care about the shocking temperature of this food and the fact that she had turned into an undead creature and no longer had digestive abilities. Not only that, Gergo was a legendary black dragon when she was alive. She could cast spells like a warlock. Perhaps it was because the act of swallowing food had evoked her memories, so this terrifying beast no longer only knew how to fight hand-to-hand like it had before. She opened her mouth and spat out large clouds of black gas that had a rubbery luster. They twisted, tangled, and changed shape. They extended a large number of tentacles and wrapped around the hound tamer. This was the spell Evar's Black Tentacles that he used as a warlock. It was very difficult to deal with. They looked like smoke, but they had amazing tenacity and strength. They stuck to the wound on the dog trainer's arm, greatly hindering the automatic healing of the wound. The dog trainer wanted to tear off the dog skin plaster with his undamaged hand, but his hand was also caught by the tentacles made of smoke. He struggled for a long time, but could not break free. When Gergo saw his opponent in such a state, he seemed to recall a trick. She used the advanced teleportation spell to transfer her body to about 100 feet above Tribulation's head, and then fell in free fall, intending to inflict heavy damage on the dog tamer with her own weight. Cusilian, who was still patting away the flames on his body, couldn't care less about anything else. The plundering dragon immediately charged towards the Houndmaster. He widened his hatchet beak-like beak and clamped down on the struggling foe with a kacha sound. He intended to solidly endure Gergo's Mount Tai crushing blow. Seeing the cooperation between his two subordinates, the immemorial brown dragon Nephilim Dis was not to be outdone. He abruptly stabbed the ground, and his two front claws sank into the sand beside him. At the same time, two giant hands of yellow sand stretched out from the sand that covered the lower half of the Houndmaster's body. Sandbind, the immemorial brown dragon roared. The two giant hands of yellow sand quickly closed together like clapping hands and slammed down on Tribulation's body, fixing it in place. With Nephilim Dis' continuous urging, the fine sand began to flow into the holes on the Houndmaster's body, attempting to burrow into his body. With a muffled thud, the Houndmaster was smashed by Gergo, who fell from the sky. The mummy megalosaurus used its hard belly to crush Tribulation, who was covered in yellow sand, under its body and rubbed it repeatedly. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The Houndmaster's sandstone body was crushed into a large number of pieces. He struggled to hold on to his flaming greatsword, intending to slash at the undead megalosaurus on top of his head, but his hard joints didn't allow him to even move his wrist. Chapter 767. There was no suspense. With a loud bang, the Houndmaster was crushed by Gergo, and a large number of fragments burst out of his body. Even the ground shook a few times because of this collision. The monsters that followed Tribulation were all too scared to move. As the main commander of this attack, the immemorial brown dragon Nephilim Dis let out a loud roar. He urged the two undead megalosaurus to ignore the Houndmaster and seize the time to attack the protrusion. Cusilian rushed to the group of monsters. The marauding undead dragon opened his sharp beak like an axe beak and spat out clouds of mist made of strong acid. Gergo once again used greater teleportation to appear in the air, and this time she smashed into the monsters. Any monster that was not agile enough was hit. For example, many horse-headed monsters and reef-clawed monsters were either turned into a pool of pus or were smashed into pancakes by the mummy megalosaurus. The two undead megalosaurus were so efficient in killing that the Pharaoh's blades beside Nephilim Dis did not have time to show their bravery. They easily pushed to the bottom of the protrusion by crawling over the monster's flesh and limbs, until they were hit by artillery. Behind a monster army, 20 semi-biological war chariots that the Emperor magically modified with the flesh of gnome pilots and steam tanks were quietly hidden in the swamp. When the marauding undead dragon and the mummy megalosaurus approached, the cannons of these war chariots all aimed at the target and launched a deafening salvo of shots. Bang, 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 bang. The sound of cannonballs being fired was continuous, and it was impossible to tell which came first. The armor-piercing bullets invented by the gnomes easily pierced through the bodies of Cusilian and Gurgo. After being turned into undead creatures, the thick scales that they were proud of as Megalosaurus were no longer as tough and sturdy as when they were alive. The two undead Megalosaurus attack was stopped, and the monster army took advantage of this moment. A large number of raven men relied on their nimble and agile movements to climb onto the enemy's body. They were like army ants hunting for their prey, specifically choosing the gaps between the scales of the two Megalosaurus to attack. The plundering undead dragon's skin, which was full of bone spikes, still had a certain degree of defense. However, the shroud on the mummy Megalosaurus was powerless against the sharp claws and swords of the enemy. The raven men used their weapons and claws to scratch Gurgo's body. His dried flesh peeled off layer by layer like sandstone. At the same time, many blazing shadow beasts also pounced on her. These monsters, which looked like large wolfhounds but were as agile as leopards, opened their glowing mouths. Puff, puff, puff. Blazing bullets of flame shot out from the blazing shadow beast's mouth and landed on the mummy Megalosaurus, igniting the shroud on her body. Soon, the shroud soaked in corpse oil was all set ablaze, and Gurgo was surrounded by flames. Although she desperately chanted incantations and used spells to summon a lot of water, compared to her huge body, that little bit of water could not solve the problem at all. What a bunch of trash! Seeing their setback, Nefermindis couldn't help but snort heavily. This immemorial brown dragon also began to chant an incantation. Relying on his powerful spellcasting ability, he summoned a desert around the two Megalosaurus. Shifting sand armor, as if unaffected by gravity, the sand all floated up and quickly gathered on the surface of Gurgo's and Cusilian's bodies. And not only did the sand provide additional protection and extinguish the flames, it also surged like waves, swallowing the monsters that attempted to climb onto their bodies into the sand. Pharaoh's Blade attack. Yellow Sand Formation, activate. Hearing their master's command, the Pharaoh's blades were roused. These constructs made of brown dragon scales and sandstone jumped into the sand beside Nefermindis one by one, sinking into the sand as if they had jumped into water. Then, they reappeared beside the plundering undead dragons and the mummy Megalosaurus. They suddenly charged out from the sand around the two Megalosaurus. Chapter 768. Headwind Hill Camp. Last night's monster attack didn't cause too many casualties, but the monster army lost a general. The morale of the Ramsey Alliance army was unprecedentedly high, and all the sergeants got up early in the morning at the sound of the horn to assemble. Sir Johnson, because the other side saved his life, Green called him respectfully. Our men are ready, but we don't know when to start. At the right time, the paladin replied. However, the Alliance army is not responsible for attacking the protrusion. In fact, we have a more important task. Counting the time, the monsters scattered in the fallen area should be on their way back now. What we need to do is to drag the incoming enemies to the plains outside of Soft Maple City. This was a typical encirclement tactic. As for the attack on the protrusion, it was naturally done by the fleet led by Keyes, as well as the weapons he prepared for the Emperor. After all, these soldiers of the Alliance army were not enough to face the lava lord-level monsters. Understood, I'll go prepare. Green had no objections. Early this morning, under the protection of the guards and paladins, he followed the retreating monsters and saw the scene of the three behemoths and the monster army fighting in the distance. The commander-in-chief of the Alliance army was shocked in an instant, not to mention that they now lacked siege weapons. Even if they were equipped with siege-stone artillery, it would be difficult for this army composed of ordinary people to intervene in a war of that level. Therefore, he no longer insisted. Green abandoned the somewhat unrealistic chivalry and put all his energy into thinking about how to use the army in his hands to eliminate as many monsters as possible. The answer was obvious. He had to find a good ambush position. There were only two options for the monsters to come to the aid of the promontory from this vast area. They could either take the sea route to Soft Maple Bay, which Grim could do nothing about, or they could pass through the forest of Upwind Knoll and reach the peninsula where Soft Maple City was located. If this was a human army, then it was possible to use him as a target with strategic value, to lead the reinforcements to the newly established camp and fight a city defense battle. But those guys were monsters. After receiving the Emperor's order, they would desperately rush to the protrusion. No matter how tempting the bait was, they would most likely not take the bait. We can only set up ambushes in the forest on Headwind Hill, arrange them in layers, and attack them in echelons. Glenn quickly came up with a way to maximize the damage to the monsters. He wanted to set up layers of razor blades in the forest so that the monsters who came to the rescue of the protruding point would willingly run into them and bleed them. It didn't take long for the army to get busy. The soldiers formed into square formations and formed a horizontal defensive line. They did not hide in the forest. Instead, they cleared all the trees within 10 steps of them with axes in advance. They tried their best to lay simple deer firewood in front of the formation. The felled trees were all piled up together and brushed with a thin layer of blazing fire glue. These elongated phalanxes didn't leave anyone behind to be responsible for the rear defense. The archers and alchemists were all transferred by Green and gathered separately. There were about 2,000 long-range shooters in total. The commander-in-chief of the Alliance army didn't engage in egalitarianism. He gathered these people into 2,000 men, plus his own family's elite longbowman unit, which he personally led. When the sniping battle began, they would shuttle between the layers of razor blades on Headwind Hill, shooting sideways at the monsters who rushed from one layer of razor blades and rushed to another layer of razor blades to rain arrows. And in charge of protecting their team, in addition to Green's personal guards, there was also the Paladin unit led by Johnson. Green believed that even if some monsters got rid of the influence of the Emperor's order and launched a charge at the long-range shooters, they would absolutely not be able to shake such a strong guard force. The last remaining question was whether the razor blades he arranged would be broken by a large number of monsters. After all, even if the monsters didn't want to fight, they would just pass by the front line. If the number was too large, it would cause a large number of soldiers in each phalanx. Chapter 769. As the last resort left behind by the Emperor before he was sealed, the Raven Men were the only monsters that could reproduce sexually. After the Emperor woke up, the ancient slave Master Ramsay made more adjustments to this monster in order to quickly expand the number of soldiers. At the cost of reducing the lifespan of the Raven Men, the Emperor greatly increased the reproduction ability of this monster. Every female Raven Man could lay a nest of eggs every week. Those newborn monsters, as long as they had enough food, could quickly grow into a mature Raven Man within 2 to 3 months like an inflated balloon. In the past year, a large number of Raven Men were bred and formed new clans. They hunted freely in the Fallen area. Now, the Raven Men all felt the call of the Emperor and desperately rushed to the protrusion. They became anxious and even thought that it would be good if they could grow wings. All the clans gathered together like rivers returning to the sea, forming a huge troop. There were at least 100,000 of them, and they had the same goal: break through the blockade of the humans. The leaders of each clan gave the same order. With their excellent eyesight, they easily found their opponents hiding in the forest of the Headwind Hill and also saw the razor formation of the human alliance. However, the Raven Men didn't care. Most of them were of the new generation. In the past year or so, these Raven Men had been hunting in the Fallen Zones, and many of them had feasted on human flesh. Although the clan leaders were as intelligent as humans and could see the power of the razor formation, they didn't think that the human soldiers could stop them from rushing to the protrusion to participate in the battle, especially when there were so many of them. As for some of the other monsters in the team, These raven men didn't care at all. Whether they died here or not had nothing to do with the raven men. In fact, except for the blazing shadow beast that was forbidden to hunt because of the protection of Tribulation's dog trainer, many small monsters such as the drooping horsehead had been on the menu of these new clans. Don't get entangled with those humans. We have to reach the protrusion as soon as possible. The first one to arrive will definitely be rewarded by the great creator and might even be promoted to a powerful general. Every raven man had similar thoughts in their hearts. Seeing that the humans had ignited the pile of firewood, they quickly changed directions and passed through the gaps in the flames. All the raven men charged towards the razor formation, ignoring the shields, halberds, and short spears hidden in the shadows. Their powerful legs kept stomping on the ground as they strode forward. Prepare for battle. On Ramses' side, every squad leader of the first layer of blades let out the same roar. They all had loud voices that ordinary people couldn't reach. The shield-wielding warriors at the very front had already used wooden wedges to firmly erect the tower shields that were covered in animal skins, painted with many layers of tree branches, and tied tightly with iron hoops. 1. Axes and halberds suddenly emerged from the gaps of the shield wall. Not all of the weapons hit their targets, but there were quite a few warriors who were able to knock down the charging monsters. Following that, they followed the way they had been trained and hacked down with their halberds. Most of the axes hit their targets, and those who were knocked down had their chests and stomachs ripped open by the axes, their intestines flowing out. 2. The axes and halberds were quickly pulled back, and the warriors standing behind the row of warriors simultaneously thrust their short spears diagonally upwards. They also held up their shields, but there were 2 people who worked together to hold the shields above their heads. At the same time, they also had to take care of their comrades, standing in the front row. Some of the raven men dodged the axes and jumped over the shield wall with their jumping ability, but as soon as they stepped on the roof of the shield wall, they were stabbed by the short spears. 3. Those injured raven men fell from the roof of the shield wall, and immediately there were warriors with scimitars and long swords coming to finish them off. The ones in charge of this job were some real veterans, and they had a good understanding of where to land the most fatal blow. At the same time, these warriors also had to look behind them, in case there were raven men who had lost their minds and started to attack the back of the razor formation. The squad leaders repeatedly shouted 1, 2, 3. It was the simplest killing action, but it was also the most efficient on the battlefield. But even so, there were still some raven men who avoided their killing. Most of them were taller and more agile than their peers, and with a long run-up, they jumped high, dodging the axes and short spears, and directly flipped over the razor formation. They were obviously more cunning than the ordinary raven men, and many of them were leaders or main warriors of some small clans. After crossing over the razor formation, they did not turn around and continued to run to the second layer of the razor formation. They wanted to cross all the razor formations in one go, and it would be best if they could be the first batch or even the first to reach the protrusion, because only then would they have the opportunity to be rewarded by the emperor and have the opportunity to be promoted to a powerful general. Unfortunately, it was not easy to realize their wish. Although the razor formation had a total of 6 layers, Grim would not let his guard down because of this. Before the battle, he had gathered the archers together and brought them along with him to personally command. Follow my whistling whistle. A round of rapid fire saturate the enemy. This was Grim's order long ago. His eyes were fixed on the raven men who had crossed the first layer of the razor formation. Wherever the raven men fell behind the razor formation, he would prioritize shooting his arrows there. The hollow arrow shafts cut through the air, making ear-piercing noises. Even in the noisy battlefield, the sharp noises were still much clearer than the other noises. The archers loaded their arrows. The front row shot horizontally while the back row shot vertically. Up to 2,000 arrows would fall at the spot Grim had marked at the same time. Fortunately, there were many layers between the razor formation. Otherwise, such a rain of arrows would indeed hurt the friendly forces. Those raven men who could not dodge in time, or there were no trees around to provide cover, were naturally shot into hedgehogs. Even if they were lucky enough to avoid the rain of arrows, the running speed of these raven men slowed down. As a result, when they ran to the second layer of the razor formation, it was unlikely that they would rely on a run-up like before to jump over. Moreover, even if they jumped over again, they would suffer the same treatment later on. 6 layers of razor formation. Even if as many as 30% of the raven men could jump over each time, at most 7 or 8 out of 10,000 raven men could luckily pass through Grimm's razor formation. Not to mention, he still had 2 skills and a trump card that he had not used yet. Therefore, it seemed that there would not be too much of a problem to complete this sniping. Chapter 770. The Raven Men were not idiots. Many of the humans who once underestimated these evil monsters, many of them paid the price of their own blood to understand this before they died. Facing Grimm's razor formation, after thousands of lives were lost, some of the Raven Men finally came to their senses. Among them, the cunning clan leaders reacted the fastest. He wants to bleed us continuously. A leader who was blind in one eye explained to his fellow nest mates with a piercing voice, "The human commander has placed clumps of iron thorns and brambles on our way forward. What should we do? The emperor has issued the order." A few of the Raven Men who were of the same age as him, but because they were weaker, they were called Nest Brothers and were not the clan leaders. They began to clamor. "Shut up, stupid birds!" The one-eyed leader shouted loudly. "What to do when you encounter iron thorns when climbing? Do you need me to teach you? You can either avoid them, or you can dig those things out layer by layer. That way you can pass through faster. Catch some of those drooped horse heads," he ordered in an orderly manner. "When the little ones charge, each of you carry one. When they were about to charge into the shield wall, they would throw that thing behind the shield wall like a rock. When the drooped horse heads start to run around behind the shield wall, you guys lead your men to attack one point and pry open a gap in the shield wall." Not long after, the Raven Men of this small clan had caught a few dozen drooped horse heads. Most of them were clan warriors. They used their sharp claws to latch onto the veins of those things, dragging their long bodies on the ground. They followed the one-eyed leader's instructions and charged towards a blade formation. However, when they were a few dozen steps away from the shield wall, the Raven Men swung their arms around and threw the horse's head towards the human's defense line, like throwing a hammer. Most of the drooped horse heads were blocked by the shield wall and then killed by the halberds. However, there were still 1 or 2 of these monsters that were thrown behind the shield wall. They fell to the ground and were in a bad mood. Therefore, as soon as they landed, these monsters with the heads of Mares, sharp teeth in their mouths, and python-like bodies behind them began to attack the humans in a frenzy. Although these little monsters were quickly cleared out by the veterans within the blade front line, with their interference, several weak spots appeared on the front line. A few warriors in the front row with tower shields couldn't keep up with the rhythm of their captain's chant. Their halberds paused for a moment, and they couldn't follow the steps of 1, 2, 3. Naturally, they became the enemy's breakthrough point. The leader of the Crowmen clan, who was blind in one eye, had his remaining eye glowing with excitement. He led his brothers from the same nest to charge forward and dash towards the 2 connected breakthroughs. While the halberd was still in between the gaps of the shield, the strong Raven Man used the momentum of the run-up and rammed his shoulder into the shield like a cannonball. The thick shoulder armor made a deep hole in the shield. What's worse was that the elbow of the Ramsey warrior behind the shield was also shattered. Because of the structure of their bodies, the impact of violent impact on the Raven Man was much smaller than that of humans. The one-eyed clan leader didn't show any symptoms of dizziness after ramming into the shield. He directly rolled on the ground and, at the same time, stretched out the scythe in his hand. With a few slashes, he cut off all the tendons of the human warriors around him. Those people suddenly fell and rolled on the ground like gourds. Because the formation was relatively dense, the fall of these people also affected many of their comrades in the formation. The small breakthrough point quickly expanded by nearly 2 times, and the originally sharp blades suddenly had a big gap. A large number of Raven Men poured into the formation from here. Knights attacked. The captain of the square formation on the flank of the blade formation immediately changed his tactic. The knights who had been waiting for a long time immediately urged their mounts to run quickly. In a row of 4 horses, they were like brushes that wiped the gap in the blade formation. At the same time, the knights on the other side also launched a charge. They were parallel to the knights on this side, forming a combing cross. This was the method that Grimm came up with to deal with the blade formation being broken. If the shield wall could be repaired during the time when the 2 teams of knights blocked the incoming enemies, then the blade formation could still be preserved. But if it couldn't, then this blade would completely lose its function. And that was the worst-case scenario. Originally, according to Grimm's estimation, the knights could continue to rest for a while. But he didn't expect that the Raven men would be able to see through the weakness of the blade formation so quickly. As more and more Raven men followed the example of the one-eyed Raven man, more and more horse heads, stones, and even burning wood were thrown into the formation to create gaps. The knights who were used as brushes were dispatched more and more frequently, and not only on the first layer of blade, but also on the second and third layers of blade formation. So much so that Grimm had to let the longbowmen of the family guards release whistles in his place, leading the long-range archers to carry out a blanket attack on the monsters between the layers. And he himself had to withdraw to activate the trump card that he wanted to use later. Activate the alchemy golems. Grimm urged his horse to gallop to the rear of the razor formation. There was a large tent there, and around the tent was a wall made of logs. Grimm entered the tent and quickly gave the order. Previously, he had gathered all the alchemists in the phalanx just for this moment. When excavating the ancient war weapons, the Ramsey people had only found an alchemy golem. But this golem had been borrowed by Keys for a few days. Using the huge resources of the scale of perpetual order, the genius craftsman Shea had actually created more than 50 replicas with stronger performance. These replicas were all bought out by Grimm. At the moment, they were in the tent. These stooped constructs were made of glass tubes, metal, and wood. On top of them was a brain, and 2 eyes floated in their tempered skulls. Although the alchemy golems were only about 1,000 pounds in size compared to other types of golems, they had a huge lethality when fighting against flesh and blood creatures. This was not only because of the needle-like claws on their fingertips that could spray highly toxic and strong acid, but also because these golems could quickly pour out various effects of alchemy bombs at the enemy like grenadiers. They would target different targets and use different combinations of bombs to find their opponents. Ordinary flesh and blood creatures could not compete with these golems at all. And the reason why Grimm had gathered all the alchemists was that he needed them to provide logistical support for the alchemy golems. As long as the alchemy golems consumed a wave of ammunition, they would voluntarily withdraw to the tent, and professionals would install new weapons and equipment for them. Then, they could return to the battlefield and continue their killing mission. Set all the monsters as targets and kill them indiscriminately. Use the alchemy bombs to reduce the pressure on our square formation. After the alchemist had completed the activation work, Grimm picked up a talisman that Keys had given him and gave the order to all the alchemy golems to attack. If the energy and ammunition are exhausted, immediately return to the camp to replenish. Chapter 771. The alchemy golems began to move. They were like clowns on stilts in a circus. They jumped over rows of bushes, passed through the gaps in the Razorbacks formation, and pounced on the Raven men who had broken through the Razorbacks' defense line. Before the battle began, every squad leader of the Alliance army had been informed of the existence of fresh troops, and those squad leaders had also conveyed this information to every soldier. But when they saw groups of alchemy golems passing by them, including the squad leaders who had solemnly warned their men not to make a fuss, all the soldiers felt a chill in their hearts. Oh my God! A longbowman with good eyesight could not help but whisper after seeing the tempered glass heads on the shoulders of the alchemy golems and the things inside. I don't want to meet such monsters. The squad leader standing next to him glared fiercely at him, then pulled the bowstring in his hand and shot out a whistling arrow with a sharp whistle. How could they have the time to think? They still had a lot of things to do, and there were more and more raven men rushing through the razor formation. Fortunately, the alchemy golems also thought so. Or rather, they were all instilled with the same idea by Grimm, who was holding the command talisman. Never let too many raven men rush through the razor formation. Inside the tempered glass head of each alchemy golem, there was a ghoul's brain. This was an improvement made by Shay from the original design under Snade's strong suggestion. Shay was originally skeptical, but the new alchemy golems that were finally created were very satisfactory to the remnant of the Wonder Craftsman. They did not need to be able to understand too many orders, nor did they need to have a particularly smart brain. These alchemy golems only needed to remember a target, and then they just needed to be as strict and persistent as the undead creatures to complete the task. After all, on the battlefield, the more direct things were, the more fatal they were. Although the alchemy golems were walking at a ridiculous pace, their speed was not slow at all. In addition, they would also use the most simple way, observation with their naked eyes, to determine where the raven men needed to be killed by them. As long as they chose a target, these alchemy golems would rush there in big strides. Before approaching the battlefield, they would first use the jet ejection device installed on their knees to jump high in the air and then accurately land in the center of the battlefield. Just as the raven men were stunned for a moment, they would stretch out their sharp claws with needles and perform a dance of death on the spot, clearing the first clump of weeds. Then, the needles would either spray a large amount of strong acid solution or spray of fuel, which would ignite and turn more enemies into torches. If the raven men were not defeated by these two attacks and still attempted to tear the alchemy golem into pieces, then the golem would use a third method. They would launch many alchemy bombs that were about the size of hand grenades into the surroundings. Because most of these alchemy bombs were temporarily filled by the alchemists in the logistics camp, even the alchemy golems that launched them did not know their specific function before they were ejected and exploded. Some of these alchemy bombs would explode into a fireball, some would become a ball of crackling lightning, and some would just be a plain bottle of strong acid. But even so, these things were still very useful, because those raven men could never guess what would explode from the alchemy bombs that fell near them. As a result, many monsters died tragically in shock and astonishment. Chapter 772. Nephilim was the first to discover the danger. He tried to stabilize the current battle line with the two undead Megalosaurus. But the volcano that suddenly rose from the ground set off waves of air and turbid flames that pushed them back. In the deep pit that was burning with raging flames, a giant with cracked volcanic rock skin crawled out. This was the strongest form of the god of calamity. The two undead Megalosaurus in front of him were about the size of puppies. Many monsters that were closer to him all fell into the volcano and were burned to ashes. But they were still inspired by the sudden appearance of this giant, because the memory that was engraved in their bones made them remember the majesty of this calamity general. The ancient memory overshadowed the mournful cries of death. The army of monsters that had been scattered and retreating suddenly burst with new courage. They rushed toward the beach, where Keys was located near Soft Maple City. Yes, the monsters did not help the Lord of Lava. Firstly, in their memory, the Calamity General was a god and did not need any help from his subordinates. Secondly, they were all intelligent and knew that just approaching the battlefield was courting death, although they did not know what the Lord of Lava was thinking. As soon as he appeared, he did cast a large-scale, indiscriminate attack spell. This god, or more accurately, a demigod, unscrupulously unfolded the power of his domain, with him as the center. Within a radius of half a mile, the sea and the ground boiled, and the rocks turned into flowing lava. The sand around Nephilim was not spared. He had to let all the pharaoh's blades out of the desert. The enemy's predicament could not be hidden from the Lord of Lava's sharp senses. This huge and scorching calamity, General laughed heartily. The sound was like the collapse of a mountain, enough to send chills down the spine of every audience. Brown dragons were immune to fire damage, but brown dragons and black dragons were not. Especially Gurgo, who had become a mummified megalosaurus. She had a constitution that made her vulnerable to fire. The scorching air around her was so hot that it directly burned the shroud wrapped around her body. Thou shalt bathe in fire. There is no escape. Seeing Gurgo flapping her wings and trying to fly into the sky, the Lord of Lava chanted a few low incantations in the earthy language. Gravity that was more than 10 times the original was immediately applied to the mummified megalosaurus. She fell straight to the ground and had an intimate contact with the bubbling lava. It was painful but stimulating. There was no good solution. She could not use her limited magic ability to counter the divine spell cast by a god. Save me, Gurgle. Gurgo kept bobbing in the lava. Her body was covered with scorch marks all over her body. And this was the effect after trying to save herself with a magic shield. Otherwise, after soaking in the lava for so long, she would have turned into ashes long ago. Accept your fate. The Lord of Lava strode forward and arrived in front of Gurgo in 2 steps. He bent down and extended his 3-fingered giant hand, as if he wanted to press the mummified megalosaurus into the lava and wash her clean. The plundering undead dragon, Cathilian, retreated far away. Coward, I will tear your soul to shreds. The immemorial brown dragon, Firmindis, roared helplessly. He had no choice but to personally rescue Gurgo. If possible, he did not want to face the Lord of Lava directly. However, if the mummified megalosaurus was killed now, they would be in an even more disadvantageous situation. Therefore, he could only brace himself and charge forward. The immemorial brown dragon opened his mouth and spat out a scorching hot sand. He was not naive enough to think that the heat of the sand could hurt his opponent. He only hoped that the kinetic energy of the breath could hinder his opponent. We've been tricked. The giant did not grab Gurgo at all. His bending down was just a feint. Chapter 773. Nefermindis's body instantly turned into sand, and yellow sand flowed out from the Lord of Lava's fingertips. Before he could react, the yellow sand actually flowed backward on his huge body, putting a set of heavy shackles on him. Calamity was temporarily under control. At the same time, someone high in the sky was also paying attention to the situation on ground. Target locked, airdrop pouch. 2 kobold airmen of the Dragonborn clan had already put the red circle on the magic lens on the Lord of Lava's body. He pressed the weight on the handle, and the towing rope below the super-large Leviathan airship instantly broke. More than 50 ropes, which were about the thickness of an ordinary person's waist, detonated at the same time with the alchemy mixture at the broken points, throwing the huge egg-shaped drop capsule hanging below it into the sky. The drop capsule twisted and swayed, but under the effect of its own weight, it finally stabilized. It fell quickly, tearing apart the high-speed but thin wind in the upper atmosphere. The air and the outer shell of the drop capsule violently rubbed against each other, and the high temperature generated burned the latter red. This drop capsule had 2 shells. The melting point of the first layer was not high, and it soon began to burn, and it peeled off piece by piece. The remaining inner layer was made of a composite alchemy clay, which not only would not break easily, but also could turbulence and decelerate. In the second shell, it was filled with an alchemy solution, which was much less dense than water and had extremely special properties. At the last moment, it could absorb a large part of the kinetic energy of the entire drop capsule through the complex magic circle carved on the inner wall of the second shell, protecting the core egg yolk to land safely. The so-called last moment referred to the moment when the drop capsule came into contact with the enemy. Thanks to the magic circle and runes, this drop capsule would not slowly reach a uniform speed due to the friction with the air like a free fall from a high altitude, but it would continue to accelerate. This was also part of its attack. Because it consumed a lot of resources every time it was dropped, it could not waste any opportunity to cause damage to the enemy. In other words, An average opponent was not worthy of a drop capsule bombing attack. This tactic was only suitable for targets with high strategic and tactical value, such as demigods or gods. And this time, Keyes sent people to bomb the newly resurrected Lord of Lava. No, as a demigod, his perception was much stronger than that of mortals. But even if that wasn't the case, no one would ignore an object the size of a mountain that fell from the sky, especially when that thing was clearly aimed at him. His legs were shackled by Gurgo, his entire body was shackled by yellow sand, and he had just been hit by a powerful curse. The molten magma lord could not move a single step. He could only try his best to reach out his palm. A large amount of lava appeared out of thin air above the Calamity General. After cooling and hardening, it formed a dome to prevent air raids. Just as he was about to do the same thing and build some defensive facilities for himself, the airborne capsule had already smashed onto the dome just now. The violent explosion spread out for dozens of miles, but it was still so loud that it hurt people's eardrums. Fortunately, after landing, Keyes immediately built a temporary beachhead fortress and had many elemental shamans reinforce it. Otherwise, the terrifying shockwave that swept over would instantly lift his subordinates into the sky. The monsters that were still attacking the fortress were all outside the fortress and had no one to rely on, so they were all lifted up by the shockwave caused by the explosion. Especially monsters like the 10-armed octopus. They were directly blown away for several miles before landing on the ground. Just the aftermath of the explosion caused by the airborne capsule's landing had almost wiped out all the monsters near the protrusion. Looking at the scene at the center of the explosion, the protrusion was originally a peninsula connected to the land, but after the explosion, it became an isolated island near the sea. The land in the middle was all wiped out by the explosion, and a large amount of seawater poured in directly. If it wasn't for a green magic shield rising from the top of the protrusion when the explosion occurred, the entire protrusion, together with the Emperor's Palace and the monster hatchery, would have been flattened after the impact. Fortunately, I did not disappoint you. Standing at the top of the beachhead fortress, Keyes faced the howling wind, and a large amount of yellow sand suddenly appeared beside him. Neferman Dis' voice came from it. At the same time as the last moment appeared, the ancient brown dragon took the opportunity to escape from the center of the explosion. Even so, he was still affected by the impact and could not restore the body of the megalosaurus for the time being. He could only condense the yellow sand into a human silhouette. As for the Pharaoh's blade and the mummy megalosaurus Gurgo, they had completely disappeared there. Okay. Keyes nodded and ignored the ancient brown dragon. His eyes were firmly locked on the center of the explosion. As the seawater poured in, the seawater came in contact with the lava emerging from the ground, and a large amount of steam rose up. Chi-chi, sounds were constantly heard and spread out for several miles. The place was now like a sauna room. Godlord Molten Lava finally got up. He was a demigod. Although he was still severely injured in the explosion, as long as the divine spark in his body was not extinguished, he would not die. However, the serious injury still made him a little slow, and his mobility and observation had decreased a lot. In addition, the rising steam blocked his vision, so he did not see a heavy punch coming from beside him. Bang! Like thunder in spring, the Lord of Lava's face was hit hard, and a large area of cracks appeared on his volcanic face. Through the steam, he saw a black shadow that was almost the same size as him. Piloting the third-generation storm armor that Shay had modified, the muscular ogre Neru saw that he had hit the enemy and could not help but shout excitedly in the cockpit. The Lord of Lava steadied himself. Looks like I have to be more serious. He suddenly flipped his palm downward, and the tide below instantly surged. Lava gushed out from the ground and formed a cudgel that was firmly held in the palm of the Tribulation General. He had been a little careless in the battle with the 3 Megalosaurus earlier, so he was ambushed by this iron lump. Now, he had adjusted his mentality. Even if he was facing an ordinary creature, he would summon the weapon he was familiar with to defend himself. It's your honor to die under my cudgel. The Lord of Lava stretched out his finger and pointed at the storm armor. Through incredible divine power, his words were clearly and unmistakably transmitted to the ears of the pilot, Neru. However, seeing this guy take out a weapon, the muscular ogre laughed loudly. As a weapon master, he was never afraid to fight with enemies who had weapons. This was because Neru had always prepared the best weapons for himself. He pressed a button, and the metal armor on the back of the storm armor instantly changed shape with a creak, and 4 mechanical arms stretched out. 2 of the arms held 2 huge chainsaws, and the other 2 hands held 2 chain hammers. The storm armor's 2 palms were now enshrouded in the radiance of magic energy. Storm armor, patroller form. Looking at the 6 weapons that suddenly appeared from the storm armor, and then looking at the stone staff in his hand, the Lord of Lava could not help but feel a little frustrated. Through the spell lens, Quest was linked to the storm mech and saw this scene in all directions. Haha, young people nowadays really don't care about martial arts, and they have a fear of not having enough firepower. Chapter 774. In order to fight against the Emperor, Shay, the remnant of the Wonder Craftsman, did not hesitate to contribute any knowledge and skills he had mastered. The reason was very simple, but also very reasonable. He found some traces related to the illusionary snake on the Tribulation General and those monsters. The illusionary snake was the original life of the Sea of Chaos. Based on the opposition between chaos and order, this race and the Wonder Craftsmen were enemies before the gods were born. It was to fight against the illusionary snake race and their ambition to pull all the planes into the Sea of Chaos that the Wonder Craftsmen used their exquisite skills to create the original Arbiter. As time passed, the gods began to spread their glory one after another. The Wonder Craftsman and the illusionary snake gradually walked from the center of the stage of the multiverse to the dusty corner. The technology that created the original Arbiter gradually disappeared in the long river of history. Now, the strongest Arbiter that the Wonder Craftsman could create was the Patroller. In theory, they were the living weapons closest to the original Arbiter. The Patroller's job was to maintain a suitable distance between the various planes, especially the inner elemental planes. Usually, they were not very concerned about the behavior of traveling between planes without permission, creating private half-planes, or pulling the existence of one plane to another plane. Only when some existence tried to establish a permanent connection between 2 different planes, or let the residents of one plane invade another plane on a large scale, would the Patroller's attention. They often had to face the conspiracy of the powerful otherworldly existence that invaded other planes through the means of plane migration. So when making the Patroller, the Wonder Craftsmen would try their best to give them as strong combat power as possible. A typical Patroller looked like a 6-armed humanoid structure made of metal and rock. The position of the legs of a normal human was replaced by a complex structure of a sphere made of several metal rings nested together. It was very much like an astral telescope. This strange structure gave the Patroller the ability to fly freely. Although the Sentinel had a pair of large metal wings, it seemed that the most they could do for their owner was to maintain balance in flight. 4 of the Patroller's 6 hands held various weapons, and the 2 hands in the lower position controlled a pair of huge metal balls surrounded by flames. They were used by the Patroller to throw elemental energy at the enemy from a very long distance. That's right, they were powerful warriors who could fight in both short and long distances. Thanks to the order inscriptions branded within their bodies, the Sentinels could not only throw acid, frost, lightning, or fire elemental energy at their enemies at will, but they could also use all sorts of spells to attack powerful opponents. Just like the Flame Balers in the Bottomless Abyss, they could use Internal Explosion once a day. Spells such as Word of Law, Curses, Disintegrate, and Force Wall could be used at least 3 times a day. If surrounded by a large number of troops, the patrols could also be like the 6-armed snake demon, rushing into the enemy's formation and unleashing a flesh and blood sword dance. When modifying the 3rd-generation Storm Mecha, Shay had ingeniously integrated the patroller manufacturing technology of the Wonder Craftsman into the crude creation of the engineering goblins in order to increase the strength of this war weapon. Of course, this was not easy. In order to complete this pioneering work, Keyes not only opened up the various resources of the scale of perpetual order, but also contributed the Megalosaurus that he had created during the Blood War. It was with the help of the Megalosaurus's innate ability, mechanical fusion, that Shay finally completed the creation of the Storm Mecha, patroller form. Although Shay was able to complete this masterpiece in 2 months with the full support of Keyes, his speed was still a little slow compared to the chaotic situation in the Ramsey Plain. Therefore, he did not have time to check the Storm Mecha. Once this war weapon, which had integrated the advanced technology of the Megalosaurus, the engineering goblins, and the Wonder Craftsman, was assembled, it was put into a special airdrop bag and taken directly to the battlefield by a super-large Leviathan airship for the final test, to fight an unprecedented battle with a demigod. On the other hand, the ogre piloting the mecha, Nalu XN, was full of confidence. Before he was sent to the airdrop, he had contacted Shay and promised to give some spoils of war to the Wonder Craftsman as research materials to repay Shay for his hard work in modifying this super weapon. Elemental rapid-fire cannons. Activate. The Storm Mecha had already transformed into 2 Y-shaped arms, dense and intense elemental fluctuations. Azure energy bullets, like 10,000-years-old ice, rapidly shot out from the arms. The order runes drawn on the inside of the mecha all lit up. Using the Celestial Stabilizer, the Storm Mecha communicated with the inner elemental plane and used it to replenish its energy. Because it was facing the Lord of Lava, the Storm Mecha fired energy bullets mixed with strong acid and frost. The 2 rapid-fire cannons fired them at a speed of 60 per second. Each energy bullet was close to 10 yards in diameter. If they hit the Lord of Lava, the frost energy would immediately explode, causing the temperature of the Lord of Lava's body to plummet. Immediately after, the acid would begin to corrode the volcanic rock of the Lord of Lava's body, weakening the strength of the demigod's body. Moreover, as a master weaponsmith, Nalu Xion understood the principle of using your strengths to attack the enemy's weaknesses. From the moment the rapid-fire cannons were activated, his crosshairs had never left the Lord of Lava's weak points: knees, ankles, waist, and neck. These were the joints of the Lord of Lava's body. If they were weakened, the Lord of Lava's body would very likely collapse on its own. The Molten Lord of God also realized this. Not only did he try his best to move the lava from the Earth's core to those positions to repair the damage caused by the energy bomb, but he also summoned the lava to form a barrier in front of him to block the subsequent energy bombs. Seeing the enemies strengthen their defenses, Nalu Exin unhurriedly stepped on the pedal beneath his feet and pushed a handle in front of him. The mechanical hydraulics on the Storm Mecha's knee joints suddenly exerted force, and the weapon of war immediately shot forward. The 4 arms on its back that held the hammer and chainsaw also began to move in a specific trajectory. Like a god of war made of steel, the Storm Mecha smashed through the solidified lava barrier. It circled around the Lord of Lava, who was still in shock, and began to perform a dance of death. The huge hammer and chainsaw smashed into the demigod's body with loud clangs, each blow chipping away large chunks of rock. The swinging of the weapons stirred up a gust of wind, blowing away the thick fog caused by the collision of lava and seawater. Chapter 775. Nalu wasn't fighting against the lava god. Instead, he was using his weapons to weaken and destroy the enemy's body. This ogre was a master of weapons. After coming into contact with a storm ship, this trait of his extended to this 230 feet tall, for million-pounds heavy storm ship. Using the independent engines distributed all over its body, the third-generation Storm Mech possessed incredible power. It strode around the molten lava god Lord with vigorous steps, not giving its opponent any chance to launch a grab attack. Apart from the weapons on the 4 mechanical arms, it was also continuously firing elemental energy bullets, using the bone-chilling frost elements and highly corrosive acid to weaken the foundation of the Lord of Lava's connection to the underground magma. In the boiling seawater, one or two pieces of ice that hadn't melted yet appeared. Molten explosion domain. Perhaps provoked by the storm mech's ferocious attacks, the Lord of Molten Lava became even more agitated. The demigod found an opportunity to push his arms outwards, blocking the attacks of the two flail hammers. At the same time, his upper body suddenly exploded. Scorching hot lava spurted out from his body, splashing onto the storm mech in front of him. This was the lava god's specialty. If he used this move in any of Ramses' cities, he could easily wipe that city off the map. The lava that gushed out was terrifyingly hot. As long as it came into contact with the lava, even steel would instantly melt into molten iron. However, the third-generation storm mech, which had been fused with the patroller's technology, was now moving against the heat. Its outer metal armor was already turning red. The engines distributed all over the mech's body were malfunctioning one after another, causing cylinder explosions in a small area. However, due to the protection of many layers of alchemy on the inside, as well as the Law Order runic array within, Nalu, who was in the cockpit of the storm mech, didn't suffer any serious injuries. He could still drive the mech forward. It walked all the way to the Lord of Lava's side. This demigod's entire upper body had disappeared, and his lower body had completely transformed into a rising volcano. Magma flowed out from his broken waist. After coming into contact with the seawater, the magma quickly solidified into volcanic rocks. Under the layers of accumulation, the volcanic rocks were about to reconnect the protruding protrusion and the soft maple peninsula. The storm mech's feet were already buried by the volcanic rocks, and every step it took would shatter a dozen feet of rock. But Lu still controlled it and forced it to walk to the side of God, Lord Lava's rising body. The two arms, which were originally used to launch elemental energy bombs, closed together with a bang. All kinds of mechanical structures quickly engaged and transformed, forming a mixture made up of wriggling gears, springs, and springs. Roar! With a deep roar, the mixture instantly turned into a ferocious dragon head. The clockwork Megalosaurus, which had been integrated into the third-generation storm mech, was revealed from its hidden state. Powered by the souls of the 5 legendary Megalosaurus, as well as the souls of a dozen old and extremely old dragons, the power of this clockwork Megalosaurus had long surpassed that of an ordinary legendary Megalosaurus. This was especially true when it launched its breath attack. The clockwork Megalosaurus opened its mouth, and a portal appeared at its throat. At the same time, a door frame made entirely of gears and springs was assembled at the top of the beachhead fortress. Quantum breath. Keys took a deep breath, and his chest and abdomen shrank into his body. Then, he spat out the quantum energy he had accumulated over a period of time at the portal that was rippling with blue light. Without any color or sound, the energy, which was very similar to the water of the Nether River and had the property of changing the probability of existence, suddenly surged into the shining portal. With Keys' help, the clockwork Megalosaurus spat out a quantum breath at the Godlord Lava's recovering body. It was almost the first Megalosaurus in the entire multiverse to use such a breath attack. As a demigod, the key to the god Lord Lava's immortality was the divine spark in its body. Generally speaking, only gods could use divine power of the same level to extinguish such a property unique to gods. And yet, after being hit by Keys' quantum breath, the Godlord Lava became both tragically and gloriously the first god in the multiverse to experience the effects of such an attack. In that instant, its divine spark seemed to be washed away by the raging waters of the Nether River. Unlike true gods, its divine spark was not protected by rules or the power of faith of its believers, which was why it was strongly eroded upon contact with quantum energy. The magma that had been slowly flowing upwards seemed to be affected by gravity again, and kept sliding down and collapsing. At the same time, the Godlord Lava had also lost its divine spark, and was gradually reverting to an ordinary volcano. The underground magma that lacked the power to sustain itself could not rampage endlessly in the ocean and could only gradually solidify. The terrifying quantum breath continued, and the storm mech took the opportunity to continue its attack. Neru controlled the war machine, continuously using huge chainsaws and chain hammers to chisel away at the volcanic crater, wanting to seal the god Lord Lava's life here. Take this final blow of mine. Neru, the pilot of the storm mech, who was already in a state of excitement, roared. The ogre stomped on the pedals with both legs, and this steel war machine that weighed over 4 million pounds leapt high into the air. For mechanical arms extended from its back, brandishing heavy weapons, and it looked like it wanted to smash this volcano, which was no longer erupting, back into the ground. At this moment, a half-giant covered in black armor suddenly appeared behind the storm mech. The Emperor, who had not shown himself for a long time, had used a teleportation spell to appear behind the storm mech. His right wrist was covered in dense, dark green runes, and he aimed at a piece of armor on the back of the storm mech and shot out a pitch-black energy ball. Spell maximum, detect weakness. Secret spell, gravity bomb. Pure gravity acted on that piece of armor, and the armor on the back of the storm mech quickly collapsed with that piece as the center. Large amounts of steel parts were crumpled into a ball. Several sets of core engines of the storm mech collapsed one after another, and even the armor on the front of the storm mech's chest was folded in the direction of the back. Hound Tamer, attack. The Emperor maintained the gravity bomb spell and could not personally launch more attacks for the time being, but he had his own methods. Not long ago, he had recovered General Tribulation, who had almost been killed by the 3 undead Megalosaurus. Now was the perfect time for him to appear and lend the Emperor a hand. He wanted to deal the final blow to the storm mech and destroy this war machine that he feared. Chapter 776. Just like the Emperor, the dog tamer also revealed his figure in the darkness. He was wearing a full body armor that was as hard as his skin. None of the black metal plates on it were flat, and there were no decorations on it. The streamlined design and layer connections made it possible to reduce the power of the attack, and at the same time, it could better protect his body that had just healed. A pair of sharp long nails protruded from the elbows of the armor, and each joint was protected by some sharp triangular thorns. Although the armor itself could be used as a weapon, the Tribulation General still held his flame whip. When he revealed his figure, the flame whip also changed into a beheading sword that was more suitable for fighting. The dog tamer delivered the last blow, but it was not under the Emperor's order, but under the order of Keys, who was really loyal to him. He swung the beheading sword in his hand, and while the Emperor was still maintaining the gravitational bomb spell, he beheaded him on the spot. The Emperor had spent too much power to wake up the 2 Tribulation Generals, the Lava Lord and the Dog Tamer. When he touched the blade, made of magic flames, he didn't even have time to put on a magic shield for himself. The sound of tearing silk rang out, and before the Emperor had time to hide the stunned expression on his face, his head and body were separated into 2. At this moment, Keys, who had transformed into a human, suddenly appeared on the battlefield. He held the dragon head war hammer named Hammer in his hand, and strange lightning flashed on the warhammer. Waving the warhammer, Keys accurately hit the Emperor's head. In the Knights tournament in Emeraldwood City, he had seen the Emperor's head separated from his body with the help of the power of magic, and then flew away. In order to prepare for today's last blow, Keys had done a lot of preparation work, and he certainly wouldn't repeat the scene of that day. When the dragon head warhammer hit the Emperor's head, lightning and thunder immediately burst out, and the head was instantly blown to pieces. Then, Keys once again used all his strength and threw the warhammer heavily at the Emperor's body that was falling down. With a loud bang, all traces of the existence of Ramses, ancient slave director, were turned into ashes in an instant. However, Keys still did not let his guard down. Snake, Keys asked his spellcaster for help. The steampunk Demolik immediately appeared at the top of the protruding protrusion, holding a lantern-like object in his hand. The smoke from the lantern quickly covered the entire mountain. This was a magical item that was used to detect soul escape techniques. If the emperor attempted to let his soul escape death, then the smoke would reflect the outline of his soul, and the caster would be able to track down that damned soul. After waiting for 2 hourglasses, other than being blown by the sea breeze, there was no change in the shape of the fog. During this process, Quest personally dug out the life support cabin from the wreckage of the storm mech, freeing the ogre Neru who was trapped inside. The super-large Leviathan airship also slowly descended, collected the mech wreckage, and then lifted it away. Although Quest had a feeling that the Emperor might have left something behind and used some method to escape, he didn't have a suitable way to track him down. He could only let Snyder continue to observe him. At the same time, he contacted Shimashaka through the scales of Eternity Chamber of Commerce and recruited a group of prophets in Sigil City to perform long-term divination on the Emperor's situation. As for now, he had more important things to do. Although the Emperor's body had completely disappeared, his lair was still at the top of the protruding protrusion. Under the guidance of the Hound Tamer, Keyes stepped into the palace that the Emperor had built for himself. He was a little curious. Why did the Emperor still refuse to give up his lair even when the army was at the border? Why did the Emperor refuse to leave the hatchery even though he had the ability to turn the Ramses into monsters in other places? What secrets were hidden in this place? They carried lanterns and walked into the Emperor's palace through a door made of jagged rocks. This was originally the sacred residence of Hierones, the god of valor, but now there was no trace of the originally sacred and solemn bluestone fortress. All that was left was the strange and terrifying ruins of the walls, and a dark green stream with a strange smell that flowed in all directions. We have to wait here for a moment. They stepped into a corridor. The Hound Tamer carried a bag containing some special powder. The powder was made by the Emperor with tree roots and the bones of some monsters. He grabbed a handful of the powder, poured it into his palm, and then blew it toward the corridor walls that were constantly swelling like living creatures. In an instant, the whole corridor immediately changed. Like a group of long snakes coiled together, the entanglements between each other were untied. The corridors were tamed by the powder and began to construct the correct paths. The left leads to the Emperor's laboratory, and the right leads to the hatchery, the Hound Tamer explained to Keyes. At this time, 2 passages appear in front of them. Which way are we going? This animated corridor will be restored to its original state after a while. At that time, we still need to spray the powder. Otherwise, if we want to break this wall, we will have to destroy the Emperor's palace. Although Keyes had no qualms about destroying this place, he had to at least dig out some useful information before doing so. So he wisely ordered the Hound Tamer, "You go to the right and bring out all the samples in the hatchery. Don't waste materials and formulas. Before you come out, set fire to the rest of the monster's egg sac and clean it up." After saying this, Keyes walked to the left passage alone. Originally, the Emperor had not been here for a long time, so the area of the palace was not large. After walking for a while, Keyes passed through the corridor and stood in front of Adamantine door. Unlike what he had expected, this door did not have any magic traps to protect it. The only thing that could prevent some bold thieves from sneaking in was the door's own weight. That was Keyes. If it were his companions, even the strongest ogre Neru, they would not be able to open this door with their strength. And if someone wanted to dig a tunnel from the side, they would find that inside the thick rock was a layer of metal wall made of adamantine, the same material as the door. In other words, the Emperor's laboratory was completely a box made of adamantine. This design was not to be underestimated. Not to mention the cost, the strong resistance and hardness of adamantine alone made it so that 99% of magic and physical means could not do anything to it. Especially when Keyes walked into this laboratory and found that there was actually a fixed half-bit wall inside. Even if he was sitting on the scale of perpetual order, he could not help but exclaim, "This is too extravagant." In terms of value alone, this laboratory made of adamantine is probably more expensive than the entire Ramsey plane. No wonder that guy was unwilling to leave his nest. Chapter 777. Stepping on the floor made of adamantine and feeling the friction between the soles of his feet and the dark lines on the ground, Keyes could not help but sigh again at the extravagance of the Emperor. This was adamantine. To carve a fine, anti-slip dark line on the surface required an extremely expensive alchemy solvent, and to carve such a dark line on the ground of the entire laboratory would require an astronomical amount of money. Unlike what Keyes had originally thought, there were not many experimental equipment in this laboratory. It only occupied a corner of the half-plane, and most of the experimental equipment seemed to have been in use for years. After searching for a long time, he finally found the center of the half-plane. There was a very imposing table there, and on top of it was a thick manual with adamantine cover. On the cover of the book, there were only 2 simple characters in the common language of the machine realm, which represented the meaning of diary. Keyes sat on the chair next to the table and wanted to open the diary of the Emperor. He reached out and unlocked the lock next to the cover. It was a chain made of mithril. One end was connected to the cover of the diary, and the other end was connected to the lock on the table. After opening the cover, Keyes saw thin gold foil. It was the paper of the diary. The characters, which were the size of mosquitoes, were neatly engraved on the gold foil. Clocktooth calendar year 20201126, ruler month, 3rd minute day. On this day, many demonic mound living in the machine realm felt sorrow for the first time in their lives. In the entire Leo Bell Tower, more than a quarter of the multi-element mound chose to die for the fallen Lord Singularity. I am also sad, but I cannot fall. As a senior consultant of the council, I will find a way to welcome the Lord back, no matter how difficult it is. Clocktooth calendar year 20201226, ruler month, 3rd minute day. After 100 years of exploration and experimentation, I have finally achieved some results. How to become a god has become a process data that can be quantitatively analyzed from being out of reach for me. But this is far from enough. After all, what we want to welcome back is not an ordinary god. What the demonic mound needs is a Lord Singularity who can lead us forward. Clocktooth calendar 20201231, Turbillion moon, 5 minutes day. Many of Demon Gray's consultants have reached a dead end in their research. They made the mistake of being dogmatic and only looked at the topic of how to bring back Lord Singularity from a mechanical perspective. Little did they know that Lord Singularity, who was able to create Demon Tomb and other half-mechanical, half-flesh life forms, would not be able to recreate a simple mechanical life form. How is that different from creating a construct? Clocktooth calendar 20210130, lever month, 3rd minute day. Demon Gray's body is a limitation. If we don't become real flesh and blood, how can we fully understand and observe the secrets of flesh and blood? I found a fantasy serpent egg, as well as the notes of an ancient fallen craftsman. The notes recorded how to use the fantasy serpent egg to cast spells and a method to deviate from the neutral side of order. It's risky, but worth a try. Clocktooth calendar 20210401, ruler month, 7th minute day. Today, fate played a joke on me. My self-modification was discovered. A unit tomb cleaner found the mechanical materials of the Demon Grave clan among the trash that was being sorted in my house. I was taken in by a few 5 elements tomb enforcers for investigation. In the end, I confessed everything about my experiment. After all, I am a pure scholar. I don't want to be treated as a murderer. Clocktooth calendar 20210501, lever month, 3rd minute day. Although I was cleared of the suspicion of being a murderer, I was judged by the government to be in danger of becoming a wandering demon because of my private fleshly experiments. Therefore, I was imprisoned for 100 years, and today, I was released after my sentence was over. During the days when I lost my freedom, I didn't waste any time. I used my brain to analyze. Clocktooth calendar 20210501, ruler month, 4th minute day. Surprisingly, even though the governor judged me guilty, he acknowledged my research spirit. However, out of consideration for the safety of the entire Demon Grave Society, I couldn't continue my experiments in the Leo clock tower. Therefore, he asked me to bring energy crystals of the same weight as myself to other planes. If only I hadn't adjusted my flesh and blood composition before, I could have taken more. Clocktooth calendar 20210-502, Turbillion month, 3rd minute day. Fortunately, I bought a bare material plane from Plane Merchant. There were only a few close relatives of fairies living there. Only dwarves who liked to play pranks but didn't have bad intentions. I bought a batch of slaves from Sigil City who could adapt to the local environment to fill up the plane. I named it Ramsey, which means new base in the common language of the machinery realm. Clocktooth calendar 20210-601, Lever month, 3rd minute day. Today is the first day I broke free from the shackles of Demon Grave's body. The conventional mechanical thinking can no longer control my mind. For the first time today, I actually had irrational and sensual thoughts. For example, I wondered if my luck would become better on the 3rd of the day of the Lever month. If I use rational thinking to analyze it, it's pure bullshit. I can actually say bullshit. I'm beginning to understand the complex emotions of flesh and blood. Clocktooth calendar 20210-666, Ruler month, 3rd minute day. What kind of damn way is this? It's cumbersome, troublesome, and lacks beauty and creativity. I won't use this way to count the years in the future. I'm the ruler of all the creatures in Ramsey. I'm their emperor. I'm the emperor of Ramsey. In the future, I'll use the imperial calendar. Also, I found the best way to transform from a flesh and blood life into a god. Divinity is not a higher characteristic than flesh and blood life, but by stripping away all the human nature of a highly intelligent life, then he can become a god. I traded for a weak social god from Sigil City. By stripping away his various human nature, I successfully promoted him to a local god among the social gods. I made him become a demigod. However, there may be a problem if I want to bring back Lord Singularity. The stripping process can't be done in a material plane or somewhere else. Only in the Leo Bell Tower, which is closest to the original nature of Lord Singularity, can the soul of a high-level demon grave be stripped away to revive Lord Singularity. No, why do I have to revive him? Since I've discovered this secret, why don't you let me become the new Lord Singularity? No, I'll become the new god of Demon Grave. Year 1000 of the Imperial Calendar, May 1st. The preparations are finally complete. My laboratory. They definitely won't think that this is not a laboratory at all, but a killing machine with a large number of order runes engraved in it. As long as I bring it to the machine realm, if anyone disobeys my orders, I'll embed this fortress of order into the gap between the teeth of the gear plane they live in. Their plane will stop rotating, and their world will be destroyed by the machine realm itself. In order to create this fortress of order, I've basically used up all the adamantine in the Ramsey plane. Precious metals, such as gold and silver, as well as various gems, have also become materials traded from Sigil City. The living standards of those slaves have dropped a little, but what does that matter? They're just consumables. My tribulation will soon transform all the intelligent creatures in Ramsey into bio-warriors. I'll transform them into humans at the end, lest those gods who have nothing to do jump out and ruin my plan. Year 1010 of the Imperial Calendar, April 1st. Those damn gods. Those damn slaves. How dare you resist me? I'm your king. Year 2020 of the Imperial Calendar, November 26th. The Avatar sacrificed himself, but his death was worth it. I, the Emperor, have been freed from the seal. Chapter 778. After reading the diary left by the Emperor on the last day, Keyes could not help but take a deep breath. He had some speculations about the motives of the ancient slave master, but he did not expect that guy to be so ambitious. Those gods didn't kill him at that time. Maybe it's because this guy had some tricks up his sleeve. Quest sat at the table and rested his chin on his palm, deep in thought. He may still be alive now. Just as he was about to get up and leave the Order fortress that looked like a laboratory but was actually used by the emperor to conquer the entire machinery realm, Keyes suddenly felt inexplicably sleepy. What will come will come. Using his willpower to suppress his sleepiness, he pushed open the thick adamantine door. He came to a place where magic would not be blocked and contacted his companions. After finishing these tasks, Keyes, who could no longer support himself, walked back into the Order Fortress. The door closed again, and the dull sound of the door closing echoed in the corridor for a long time. In the beachhead fortress near the ruins of Soft Maple City, the camel and polar bear soldiers were now ready to go. They were going to clean up all the remaining monsters in this area. As for the ancient brown dragon that had made a miraculous contribution to the beach landing, it slowly walked towards the sea under everyone's astonished gazes, and then gradually transformed back into its original Leviathan form. The ogre, which Dr. Paru was taking care of his injured brother, while their other brother, Brew, was busy dealing with the matters that Keyes had told him before going to bed with Sneyd and Brock. According to the agreement signed with the Ramsey-Human Alliance, after killing the Emperor, the scale of perpetual order would claim the fallen area that had been occupied by the Emperor and captured all the living people to make monster embryos as a reward for their labor during this period. The commander-in-chief of the Alliance Army, Grimm, had just finished the defensive battle at Headwind Hill and was resting with the main force of the Alliance Army. Brock, Brew, and Sneyd had to quickly determine the scope of the fallen area and sign a written agreement with Grimm. Once the threat of the Emperor disappeared, the alliance of the Ramsey city-states would also collapse. The Alliance Army will soon be disbanded. At that time, Green, the commander-in-chief of the Alliance Army, would also lose his power. Soft Maple City originally included cities, towns, and villages. This is the largest area that has fallen into enemy hands. In addition, considering our cooperation with the Green family, even if we can give up the area near the ruins of Emeraldwood City, we still have to take over the two forests where Emeraldwood City and Soft Maple City used to be. Furthermore, there are still some scattered areas on the east and west coast that have fallen. As long as the city-states that have joined the Ramsey Alliance, the city-states within their borders will also be dealt with by the scale of perpetual order. Although the steampunk half-lich was undoubtedly the most intelligent among the three of them, the Ogre Brew undoubtedly had more ideas in terms of logistics and colony management. Hence, Brew was the one who took the lead in deciding on the relevant content. Sneyd, on the other hand, was mainly responsible for the recovery of the monster corpses. Out of respect for the pride and customs of the Ramsey people, he did not think about the dead humans. But he did not intend to let the dead monsters go to waste. I want to recover all the monster corpses. The Chamber of Commerce will have a large number of skeleton puppets and demonic soul corpses to sell in the future. Those seriously damaged corpses also need to be dealt with as soon as possible, turning them into raw materials for flesh and blood, or making them into corpse demons for preservation. In order to complete this work, the Chamber of Commerce needs to allocate about 6,700,000 disaster coins as a startup fund. The Half-Lich calculated for a long time and gave a relatively accurate number. He stretched out his mechanical prosthesis and snapped his fingers. Then, a piece of craft paper with the details of the list appeared in his hand. In addition to the two of them, Brock also participated in the work of taking over the fallen area. He was mainly responsible for the planning and management of the residents of this land. The most important thing was how to deal with the inevitable conflict between the returning Ramsey people and the kobolds, camels, polar bear men, desert elves, and other races that would definitely colonize here in the future. For this purpose, he specifically studied the military regulations of the commander of the 9 prisons of Bader provided by Keyes, as well as the relevant laws of various races and countries that he found in Sigil City. In the end, Brock refined 3 basic systems. First, the interests of the scale of perpetual order would be dominant. At the same time, the Chamber of Commerce would also provide shelter for the various races living on this land, as well as social welfare, including but not limited to medical treatment and infrastructure construction. Second, with the contract endorsed by the scale of perpetual order as the basis for individual ownership, abolishing the currency issued by the gnomes, and using the vouchers issued by the Chamber of Commerce as a tool to measure value, consumption, and management. Third, respect the cultural differences between the various races. The main cities would be settled in settlements, while the villages and towns would be settled in the same way. The Chamber of Commerce would arrange for governors in each settlement, and, at the same time, the races in the settlement could also elect their own city leaders and chiefs to be the governor's deputies. However, the armed forces of the various races would be incorporated into the Chamber of Commerce's armed forces, and the Chamber of Commerce's armed forces in each settlement would be under the command of the governors appointed by the Chamber of Commerce. No settlements or individuals were allowed to have private armed forces. After an intense discussion, the three people in charge summarized the plans in their respective fields and combined them into a complicated contract with more than 300 pages and more than 600,000 words. Thanks to the help of the current legal and diplomatic advisor of the scale of perpetual order, Namen, they were able to finish writing this flawless contract in one night. In fact, if not for the fact that Keyes had instructed them in advance not to plunder and colonize the Ramsey Plain while he was in deep slumber, and not to excessively destroy the stability of the Ramsey Plain, or incite armed conflict with the gnomes and Ramsey humans. With the participation of the contract demon in drafting the contract, it was not as simple as flawless. Perhaps all the Ramseys in the future would become soul prisms after death. This was not an alarmist statement. The contract demon did indeed have such knowledge and ability in the field of fiddling with contracts. As long as he used his innate ability to communicate with the 9 prisons of Bader when writing the contract, then the contract will be recognized by the origin power of the 9 prisons of Bader. Any attempt to break the contract would be a blasphemy against the core values of the 9 prisons of Bader and would definitely attract the expeditionary army of the devil. However, Keyes was not that black-hearted. Although they were both in the lawful evil camp, he was not a devil. He still had one enemy, or even 2, in this plane that he had yet to deal with. Now, he still wanted to unite as many friends as he could. Moreover, he was currently in the deep slumber unique to Megalosaurus. Before he woke up and entered the youth stage, it was indeed not suitable for him to do too many things. Chapter 779. The signing of the contract went very smoothly. After understanding the strength of the scales of Eternity Chamber of Commerce, as well as receiving the compensation from the Chamber of Commerce, the guarantee of rebuilding Emeraldwood City, Grimm decided that it would be a great waste if he didn't use his power after it had expired, so he stamped the seal of the Ramsey Alliance on the contract. A few days later, this temporary alliance was reduced to nothing. The various human city-states of the Ramsey Alliance reverted to their old ways, becoming mutual restraint, competition, and occasionally starting local wars. However, the contract continued to be recognized. Some cities in the south did not fall into enemy hands, so they would not pay any substantial losses. There was no need to offend the powerful scale of perpetual order. The largest fallen area in the north was Soft Maple City, which had long been turned into ruins. Even a mayor had been killed by the priest of the dwarf god for some unknown reason. He had become a fallen fishman. Therefore, the Chamber of Commerce's move to take over the fallen land was not obstructed by the government. Only a few rich merchants and landlords who originally lived in Soft Maple City felt that their interests had been infringed and wanted to regain all the rights and interests of the land. Of course, they were not arrogant enough to challenge the scale of perpetual order. These people took a lot of gem coins when they fled, and they wanted to use these coins to redeem all the original land. However, the scale of perpetual order refused their demands. Those gem coins made of glass had no purchasing power at all. It was just a scam invented by the dwarves of Dwarf Island to control the financial system of the Ramsey Alliance. Some rich merchants were so angry that they used their gem coins to recruit some mercenaries in the south. They naively thought that the area controlled by the Chamber of Commerce was too large, so it was impossible to notice them secretly occupying a small piece of land. However, these people only needed to put their thoughts into action. Then they, along with the mercenaries they hired, would eventually appear in a labor camp that was responsible for cleaning up the ruins of Soft Maple City. When they died, their souls would also be cast into soul prisms. Thanks to the high efficiency of the labor camp, as well as the joint efforts of the camels and the elemental shamans of the polar bear people, the ruins of Soft Maple City were cleaned up in less than half a year. 3 years later, a new trading city appeared in the Ramsey Alliance. This city was named King's Landing City, and it was like a giant beast entrenched in the northernmost part of the Ramsey continent. The city was neatly planned, with only 2 districts, the industrial area and the port trade area. It belonged to the scale of perpetual order. The races that worked and did business in this city all lived outside the city, where the environment was better. A few years ago, Grimm had led the Ramsey Alliance army to set up the Razor Formation to fight against the army of returning monsters. Now, several towns and villages have been built on top of the Headwind Hill to house the residents of different races. 2 parallel tracks connected these towns and villages. Every morning and evening, there would be several steam barges that would bring the residents to and from work or to King's Landing City to trade. Ordinary people only needed to buy a monthly card, and they could use this kind of transportation to commute for a month. The cost of purchasing such a monthly card could be easily earned by working in the city for a day. In addition to King's Landing City, during the reign of the Emperor Monster Army, there were a large number of scattered and smaller areas on the east and west coast of the Ramsey Alliance. The scale of perpetual order took over these enclaves one by one and built a port as a link. The larger enclaves were quickly upgraded to towns, and the Chamber of Commerce funded the construction of a road system. If bandits dared to rob on these roads, they would be quickly arrested. Although the cleaning of the ruins of Soft Maple City had been completed, the Chamber of Commerce still needed a large number of oarsmen as labor. These bandits would contribute their all to the scale of perpetual order. The smaller enclaves were originally fishing villages along the coast, and the Chamber of Commerce did not make many changes during the planning. If there were residents who had fled to the fishing villages, as long as they were willing to pay the corresponding fishing tax, the Chamber of Commerce would allow them to return to their homes. In fact, compared to the lords who originally ruled the fishing villages, the taxes collected by the Chamber of Commerce were only about half. The scale of perpetual order had a large business and a large number of refrigerated transport ships, so the fishermen were allowed to pay taxes with their catch. It had to be known that this was completely impossible in the past. Because there were no refrigerated transport ships, the catch could only be circulated in a very small area, so it could not be sold at a high price. Now, the fishermen's income had increased a lot, but the taxes they had to pay had decreased a lot. The days of not having enough to eat were gone, and there was still some money left to spend. Many small chambers of commerce in the nearby cities even extended their trade to these places. Although they could only receive vouchers from the scale of perpetual order when they sold goods, those vouchers could be used to buy more things in King's Landing City and other large towns. They could then transport those goods to other cities and make a round trip back and forth, and they could earn a large profit. The scale of perpetual order did not restrict the actions of those small chambers of commerce, and even consciously added fuel to the fire. Its purpose was to promote the full circulation of goods and vouchers in the Ramsey Plain. It was like a dialysis. Those small chambers of commerce were like blood vessels, and the blood that flowed through them was the currency controlled by the dwarves. But now, the things that flowed through these blood vessels were gradually replaced by vouchers from the scale of perpetual order. Wealth moved people's hearts, and in the face of huge profits, some merchants would choose to take risks. Of course, they did not dare to make a move in towns and cities tightly controlled by the scale of perpetual order. Those people had their eyes on those small enclave fishing villages. Some large chambers of commerce began to infiltrate those fishing villages. They wanted to support powerful local agents to force the purchase and sale of goods in order to amass more vouchers. Then, through these vouchers, they could monopolize some specific goods and reap huge profits. There were also some more ambitious, or perhaps more daring, guys who actually had ideas about those vouchers. They even invited many alchemists to try to crack the anti-counterfeiting system of the vouchers, so as to make a large number of these vouchers for profit. However, this was a world where magic existed after all, and the vouchers themselves were contracts. Every voucher issued in Ramsey was a contract written by a contract magician using his innate ability. If there was even the slightest violation of the trading principles, these vouchers would automatically be destroyed, and a curse would be placed on the violator. These curses would not cause any harm to those people, and the only effect was that they were very difficult to remove. Moreover, with the use of a special lens, anyone could easily see the faithless mark on the person's head. They would be tracked down and arrested by the scale of perpetual order. If they dared to escape, they would also be punished, including but not limited to fines, physical destruction, and having their soul cast into a soul prism. In short, any person or group that wanted to destroy the new order built by the scale of perpetual order would be severely punished. No matter what kind of influence that person had among the humans in Ramsey, the scale of perpetual order would not tolerate it. Chapter 780. In the Devil's Stomach Tavern in the Portrait area of King's Landing City, there was a mina that could spit out profanities in dozens of languages. Over the years, its existence had shocked many merchants and travelers who came to rest here. Before the fight broke out, everyone thought that it was the blue-tongued bad guy perched on the shelf next to the fireplace that was viciously cursing and fiercely insulting the burly man from the southern part of Ramsey. The man occupied the seat closest to the fireplace and studied the horn chess pieces on the ebony chessboard with rapt attention. He ate the tavern owner's signature dish, which was stewed with chickpeas, carrots, dried lemons, and mutton. His broad shoulders were turned away from the bird, and he faced the door of the tavern and the window with its shutters open to the blue evening mist. On this autumn night, which was not too cold, only the burly man and the mina, who were residents of the southern part of Ramsey, needed warmth. The burly man's background was a mystery. He wore gray padded armor with threads on his hood. Inside, he wore a long, tattered white sweater, which made people think that he had once worked for a city lord in the south. However, the brass keyholes on his canvas boots showed that he had been to some cities in the west, where many herdsmen liked to wear such boots to graze or hunt on the grasslands. In this small tavern full of merchants from all over the world, no one dared to ask the burly man if he could understand the profanities. His skin was the color of rust, and his bulging muscles showed that he had extraordinary strength. Not to mention, he carried a giant axe that was half the height of a man on his back. The surface of the axe was engraved with fine runes. The reason people could see the runes was because there were some dried bloodstains on them. Other than the mina, no one was willing to provoke such a maleficent person. After all, the merchants had come to June Lin City to plunder wealth, not to throw away their lives in vain because of a brawl. Therefore, some of the guests in the tavern admired the bird's bravery for a moment. It seemed to be cursing the burly man in perfect camel dialect for his eagerness to devour the food. It was like the greed of a hybrid between a vulture and a monkey when it saw rotten meat. However, before anyone could realize that this curse was too subtle and beyond Mina's ability to speak, therefore, the bird was innocent. The strong man put his left hand into his boot. His movements were smooth and uninterrupted, as if a spear falcon had descended from the sky with death. A shining steel blade appeared out of nowhere. The cowhide wrapped around its rough hilt. It leaped over the bench and pounced at the prey. The sound was like an impatient hand cutting open an envelope. The dagger cut open the black, wide-brimmed hat on the prey's head. The prey was a short and stout war-creature. He came from a country that was shrouded in cold winds and thick fog all year round. He had just arrived at King's Landing City by boat in the afternoon. His face was gloomy. His skin was as white as butter. 2 black curtains on both sides of his round face. The hat, the weir creature's head. As if it was expressing its surprise, the hat was still shaking after being nailed to a pillar on the wall. The war creature shouted a strange monosyllabic word in a cold dialect. In the fireplace, the hot coals that had been piled up into a fortress had collapsed into a pile of ashes, and many people could hear the cracking of the kettle lid on the hearth. The benches creaked as the travelers, who were looking forward to a fight, spat at their feet and fanned the flames of the two intruders with random words. "Foreigner, you have to pay for my hat. This is a top-notch product made of silk, and it's the most popular style this year." The war creature gripped the dagger with 2 fingers, his sharp nails piercing through the leather covering the handle. He pulled out the dagger, and with one hand holding the hat with a hole in it, he threw the dagger back to its original owner with the other hand. Obviously, the compensation he was talking about was not money. He wanted the other party to use his life to compensate for the damaged black wide-brimmed silk hat. The dagger tore through the air and let out an ear-piercing screech. Everyone in the tavern felt their hearts in their mouths. "What? You? What?" All sorts of strange cries rang out. Some were worried, some were afraid, but most of these adventurers were excited. The dagger did not pierce the man's bald head, which only had a ring of grayish-black hair. Instead, it pierced through an ebony chessboard and was stuck there. Just as everyone was waiting for the conflict to escalate, 2 knocks suddenly came from the bar counter. Dang, dang. The owner of the tavern, Mr. Gris, walked out from the kitchen and slammed a long-handled iron spoon on Sinmu's bar counter twice. "I don't care if you want to have fun, but if you break anything in the tavern, I'll send you to a labor camp to work until the end of time." But after saying this threat, he immediately put on a relaxed expression and pointed to the side with the ladle. It was the tavern's menu blackboard. 2 bartenders with the nicknames Crooked Mouth and Single Eye had already wiped the writing on it with a brush. They used chalk made of chalk to write on it. One of them was responsible for half of the blackboard. Obviously, the owner felt that there was no difference between making money by taking care of customers and making money by watching customers die. The rust-colored man stood up and quickly pulled out the dagger from the chessboard. Then he pulled all the chess pieces and the broken chessboard into the deerskin pouch at his waist. He picked up his axe. "I'm Naman from the south. What's your name? I rarely kill nameless people. Of course, I might make an exception today." The passenger, who was much shorter than him, undid the lock on his neck and threw back his fur cloak, revealing a muscular body. Most of the passengers recognized him as a beast man. His canine teeth were protruding and even protruded out of his lips. He had a thick beard on his cheeks and a pair of pale yellow, beastly eyes. However, his skin was very fair. He was not a beast man or a barbarian. "Your father, I'm Cullian." As he spoke, he reached into the 2 leather pouches at his waist. When he took them out, Cullian had a pair of boxing swords on his hands. "You're obviously a boorish person. Why are you pretending to be a gentleman playing chess?" "Pooey." Cullian arrogantly spat a mouthful of thick phlegm in front of Naman. Following that, he pounced forward. Even though the devil's stomach was a relatively large hall, it was still indoors. His opponent was taller than him, and the weapon he held was a battle axe that required more space to be used. Cullian was clearly bullying him. However, the burly man named Naman did not mind. He used a strange crab steps to circle around Cullian. However, no matter how he moved, the axe in his hand was always aimed at Cullian's chest. Among the many tavern patrons, many of them were warriors. Seeing this high-level brawl, they could not help but feel their blood boil. Many of them even ran to the bar counter and placed their bets according to the constantly changing odds. Chapter 781. The short and stout war creature strode forward with his 2 short legs, sometimes taking small steps, sometimes crossing his feet. The tip of his fist sword was always pointed at his opponent's heart and throat. The tall southern warrior circled sideways with a strange crab-like footwork. He bent his knees and stared into the weird creature's eyes. His right hand firmly held the end of the axe handle, and his left hand loosely held the front part of the axe handle. After a few brief contacts, they clumsily and almost gently weighed each other, always ready to seize the fleeting opportunity to kill each other. Many onlookers admired the professionalism shown by the two, but other travelers crowded under the eaves and courtyard arcades became more and more impatient with this intimate interaction. They taunted the duelists and urged the two to hurry up so that they could go back and rest after dinner. In their extreme boredom, they had unknowingly doubled the stakes. With the help of people with ulterior motives, the news of the duel spread throughout the portrayed area of King's Landing City. People who came to watch the fun had already surrounded the entrance of the Devil's Stomach. The audience yelled and waved their fists, constantly mocking the two duelists. Under the impetus of this atmosphere, Corian and Naman cleared the last trace of regret in their minds, and they finally rushed together. The giant axe buzzed and vibrated, as if it was dragging the tall Naman towards Corian's abdomen. The blade of the axe reflected the orange-red flames and the blue halo of the lit cetaceans in the chandelier. Accompanied by the twilight projected from the window, it drew a strange arc. The war creature stared at the giant axe and jumped away. The blade of the axe flew towards his head. He squatted down to avoid it and rolled on the ground. Judging from his short and stout body, he should not be a war creature such as a tiger man, werewolf, or rat man. But if he was a bearman or boar man, then his movements were so agile that it was almost against the rules. He was 100% better than his peers. He jumped up behind Naman and kicked the burly man's butt. His expression was so serious that it could be said to be childish. When the onlookers saw this huge contrast in expression, they could not help but burst into laughter. "You're courting death." Naman seemed to be burning with anger. His technique of wielding the axe gradually became careless and unmethodical. However, it was undeniable that his strength was truly immense. Whatever the axe hit, it would smash into pieces. Tables, chairs, and even the stone floor of the tavern. When the ferocious axe once again struck the bluestone floor, sparks flew everywhere and a deep crack was left on the smooth and clean floor. The owner of the tavern, Mr. Griss, immediately roared angrily, "You two bastards, if you don't compensate me for my loss later, I'll definitely find someone to send you to a labor camp and work you until you die." However, the two of them were clearly intoxicated. They would not be moved by the words of the outside world. The giant axe once again dragged the Nam men towards the opponent, just like a war horse dragging the corpse of a cavalryman. Once again, Corian seemed to be staggering, but was actually light as he quickly retreated a few steps. However, just as the giant axe brushed past him, this guy suddenly thrust out the fist sword in his left hand. Pada, the small branch of the fist sword, was stuck on the handle of the giant axe. The war creature immediately twisted, and the fist sword locked the giant axe in place. Immediately after, his body seemed to bend. His right leg kicked the ground and took a step forward. At the same time, his right arm swung forward like a snake coming out of its hole. The fist sword in his right hand ruthlessly stabbed towards Naman's neck. Either let go or die. Naman could only let go of the giant axe in his hand and quickly took 2 steps back. The giant axe fell to the ground and smashed with a clang sound. Corian was unforgiving. He waved his 2 fist swords and stabbed towards the opponent's chest at the same time. However, every dog has its day. This time, it was time for him to fall into the trap. Naman sidestepped like Corian and dodged the stab. His 2 long arms even grabbed the opponent's wrist. "Let's go," the tall man exhaled. It was obvious that he had learned throwing skills in the grasslands west of Ramsey. In an instant, he had a sack on his back and slammed the war creature to the ground over his shoulder. Taking advantage of this opportunity, Naman held Corian's 2 arms and pressed the fist sword towards the weir creature's throat. The sharp blade was close to Corian's neck, and the weir creature, who was lying on his back, was obviously not easy to resist. Many onlookers saw that the two were in a struggle and immediately ran to bet again. This time, they all bet on Naman. Ayo! However, as if to keep people in suspense, the fight unexpectedly took a turn. Under the threat of death, Corian did not hesitate to transform into a half-human, half-beast form. Hair grew from the surface of his body. His facial bones instantly deformed. His mouth began to protrude forward, and his canine teeth became sharper and thicker. His bulging muscles even tore the undershirt on his body. He's a bearman? Why does he look like a polar bearman? No, how can a polar bearman be so short? That's right. Besides, have you ever seen a polar bear with dark circles under its eyes and black paint on its body? When the onlookers saw Corian's panda-human form, they immediately discussed. To be honest, this guy did look like a polar bearman after transforming. He had a lot of white fur on his body, but his body shape and the black fur on his body were very different from a polar bearman. Not to mention, the polar bearman was actually an independent, intelligent race. They had nothing to do with the war creatures. I remember now. I saw this war creature in the harbor trade area before. He was the owner of a furniture store with bamboo furniture as his main product. Because many polar bear men liked bamboo furniture and always patronized his store, he often used this form to do business in that store. One of the onlookers slapped his forehead and told the story that had stayed in the corner of his memory. The were beast and the polar bearman had a good relationship. He was always willing to give customers a discount. He even held a lucky draw in his shop on the day of the celebration. The southerner is in trouble. Even if he wins the final victory in this fight, he will be hated by the polar bearman. Hearing this, many of the onlookers grinned. They now only hoped that after the fight ended, the owner of the tavern was willing to pay the compensation quickly. Then they could quietly slip out of the devil's stomach and avoid being caught and interrogated by the security management team of King's Landing City. After all, there were a lot of polar bear people and camel people in this city. What a pity. In the corner of the tavern, a drinker picked up a large glass of rum and poured it into his throat. Then he said to his companion beside him, "That guy's a good warrior, but he provoked the wrong person at the wrong place." However, his companion, who was wrapped in a robe, but still couldn't hide his thin body, shook his head. Not necessarily. If that guy has some friends to help him, he may still be able to escape from here. As he spoke, he also showed the thing in his hand to his drinking companion. As far as the name Devil's Stomach is concerned, this place still doesn't live up to its name. Seeing that the man had bent down and rolled the two ball-like things out along the floor, he could only pour all the rum into his throat. Then he tightly shut his mouth and nose. At the same time, his heart was full of resentment. Damn dwarf, you're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.